Chapter 238. The Outer Islands. This was a primitive and wild area, divided from east to west by the Amazon River. The east was the territory of the Amazons, and the west was the territory of the indigenous people. The struggle between them had lasted for many years. Because the Storm Lord did not manage the church in the mortal world, the temple did not spend too much effort to pacify these indigenous people. The indigenous people retained the primitive totem belief, which would give birth to powerful demons and demigods. Without the power of the gods, it would be difficult to destroy them. This was a very dangerous place. Even the female Amazons would be extremely careful when they were moving around in the tropical jungle. There were many powerful monsters, strange plants, dangerous environments, ferocious indigenous people, and all kinds of unexpected and dangerous things. Recently, on the island near the northwest, a group of outsiders appeared. They did not arrive for a long time and there were not many of them, but they were very powerful. In a short time, they occupied part of the island of about 120 square kilometers. These outsiders with grayish-black skin looked like elves, but they were more ferocious and better at fighting. The nearby natives temporarily retreated because of their strength, but sporadic battles still occurred from time to time because the natives were very repulsive of outsiders. The terrain of the outer islands must be mentioned here. Due to a huge change in a certain era, the outer islands had experienced the collapse and shift of the continental shelf plates, so that they were scattered into hundreds of islands of various sizes. The largest of these islands was the Amazon jungle, which was almost the size of 3 Japanese islands. Then there were other scattered islands. The larger ones were hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and the smaller ones were only 10 square kilometers. These islands were scattered and relatively dense. They were connected by shallow sea areas and inland rivers, so the outer islands were seen as a whole from the outside world. This used to be a continent. In the end, because of some disasters in the Arcane Era, it became what it was today. The arrival of the drows aroused the hostility of the indigenous people. They had not been able to adapt to the primitive and wild environment here. In their view, the outer islands were even more dangerous than the Underdark. For a long time, their lives were quite difficult, but recently they were a little better because the messenger sent out brought back a batch of important supplies, which temporarily met their needs. Unfortunately, these supplies could only support them for 3 months at most. After 3 months they would return to a difficult state again. Dark Blade was in a bad mood. He sat on the wall of the camp and observed his surroundings, playing with a dark green blade in his hand. Ever since he accepted the help of His Excellency Throat Cutter and brought back a batch of important supplies, he had been in a bad mood. Of course, it was not because of His Excellency's help and request. As a drow, he knew very well that everything needed to be repaid. What he was unhappy about was the High Priestess opposition. This old-fashioned old woman had rejected such an important opportunity to help the race out of the predicament just because she said, "Humans cannot be trusted, and surface creatures have ill intentions towards us." A drow with a delicate face and a longbow on his back appeared in the distance and quickly approached. Dark Blade ordered the others to open the gate. Then he frowned and said, "Lasker, what's the situation? Are there any new movements from those aborigines?" This was a ranger. The drow rangers were all experts, and only they could easily travel through the cruel tropical jungles. The young drow ranger jumped lightly, then jumped onto the wall and said in a deep voice, "The movements of the aborigines are fine. They are just monitoring the nearby area. As long as we don't step into their territory, there shouldn't be any violent conflicts in a short time. But I found that there seem to be more man-eating plants nearby. There should be some kind of powerful energy field under this island. Although it won't affect living people, it will gradually mutate many plants." Dark Blade nodded slightly, then frowned and said, "What about the movements of those ants?" As if he remembered something. The young drow ranger's face changed and he whispered, "They have moved to the other side of the island, but I don't know when they will come back. We lack enough supplies to deal with them. The next time they migrate, we can only escape to the sea." Dark Blade sighed, then slammed the wooden fence and said anxiously, "Those damn ants. These terrible creatures." In his long life he had never thought that ants could be so dangerous. When their numbers reached an unimaginable number, these seemingly inconspicuous creatures that could be squashed to death could even kill a giant dragon. They were marching ants. The creatures at the top of the food chain in the tropical rainforest. When they first encountered these terrible ants, 37 people died in their group, including 5 high-grade professions, a talented warlock, and a warrior who was about to enter the legendary realm. They had no ability to resist at all. When these ants appeared, A warrior who was close to the legendary realm only lasted for 3 minutes before he was bitten into a pile of bones. If they hadn't evacuated quickly enough and had the help of spellcasters, perhaps the whole group would have been eaten by these terrible ants. Marching ants. The nightmare in the tropical rainforest. Most of them were ants that crawled on the ground, but 1/10 of them were ants with wings that could fly. The number of these ants was so large that it was impossible to calculate. They preyed on any creatures during the migration. They had extremely sharp mouthparts. Dark Blade even suspected that they could eat the scales of dragons bit by bit. These terrible ants were the top predators on the whole island. They even saw a Quetzalcoatlus being eaten clean in just 5 minutes. It couldn't fly away even if it wanted to. If it weren't for the regular movement of these ants, they definitely wouldn't have survived until now. Dark Blade sighed and said slowly, "Since we came back, the population of our group has decreased by 8. If this goes on, our people will become fewer and fewer. I'm afraid that we will completely disappear from this land in the future." Damn it. Why didn't you accept the help of that human? Even if you have to pay a price, it's better than watching your people decrease bit by bit, right? The nearby drows didn't speak. The High Priestess had been leading the group after the fall of the Dark Maiden. Although she was very stubborn and old-fashioned, she had ruled the group for a long time and had also survived many crises. This kind of majesty had been deeply rooted in the people's hearts. Not many people dared to question her decisions face to face. If it weren't for the fact that the group was getting more and more miserable, Dark Blade wouldn't easily question the arrangement of the High Priestess. Dark Blade. A female drow appeared. She looked at the others on the fence and said in a deep voice, "Her Excellency the High Priestess asked you to come over. There is something important to discuss." Most of the males in the group were warriors, rangers, and rogues. The spellcasters were mainly concentrated in the females. They still maintained the tradition of females having a higher status. Without any hesitation, Dark Blade jumped down from the fence and walked towards the largest wooden house in the center. Many people had gathered in the room. Most of them were female drows and some were male drows like Dark Blade. Sitting at the top was a female drow priestess with an old face. With their relatively long lifespan, such an old face also proved that she had lived for a long time. This was the High Priestess of the Drows. Although the Dark Maiden had fallen, she still had the ability to cast magic. Even if this ability had been greatly weakened, she was still the most powerful drow in the group. Dang dang dang. The High Priestess knocked on the ground with her cane and motioned for the others present to be quiet. During this time there were many arguments and conflicts in the group, mainly focused on whether to cooperate with the human who helped them, whether the other party was malicious, whether the human on the surface was trustworthy, and so on. The drows were pure conspiracy and betrayal in their bones. Even if they believed in the kind Dark Maiden, this could not completely change the nature of the drows, not to mention that the Dark Maiden had fallen for some time. Ahem, ahem. The old High Priestess coughed, then said in a hoarse voice, "I just got a message from the Ko people. Maybe we should reconsider some things." The High Priestess had many mysterious abilities. After she came here, she established contact with the nearby Ko people. Although the relationship between them was fragile. The High Priestess glanced at the others and said, "I just learned that the human who provided us with help has killed one of the 3 pirate kings on the south coast, the Swamp King. His power should not be underestimated. The nearby sea creatures have heard of his name. I think we should reconsider." These words caused an uproar. Naturally, they had heard of the 3 pirate kings on the south coast. They were all legendary figures. Dark Blade couldn't help but show a strange expression on his face. He couldn't tell whether he was happy or sad. He always felt that everything in front of him was a bit dazzling. At first, he tried his best to persuade others to cooperate with His Excellency Throat Cutter, but in the end, his proposal was still rejected by the High Priestess. But now that she heard that he had killed one of the pirate kings, the High Priestess actually took the initiative to reconsider. What an ironic result. Chapter 239. Futu is really sick recently. Writing is a little difficult, please understand. This is a 5,000-word chapter. Port Tylon. In a rather remote tavern, Soren sat in the corner and waited. Outside there were pirates acting as guards. There were 3 or 5 maids with heavy makeup near the bar. From time to time, they would slightly move to show the beauty of the female body, trying to attract Soren's attention. With enough strength and fame, his wealth naturally began to increase, and even the number of underlings under him increased. Soren was not the kind of person who liked to be surrounded by followers, but his current identity naturally required a group of men to serve him. The owner of this tavern was Sturgeon, a chubby middle-aged man. He looked like a businessman, but he was indeed a businessman, but he was the leader of a small group of pirates. This guy had sought refuge with Soren in the beginning, and now this tavern was also Soren's territory. He did not plunder and collect the assets of his men, because that would be digging his own grave, but he required everyone to obey his command. He did not care about the wealth of Port Tylon. As long as he could open up the outer islands and occupy a gold or silver mine, his wealth would increase rapidly. There were some rules in this world. Many people did not use their real names and liked to use their titles to do things. Just like Soren's throat cutter, there were not many people who knew that his real name was Soren. Most people respectfully called him Your Excellency Throat Cutter. Sometimes the real name was taboo. Soren had no interest in the barmaids with heavy makeup. He sat in the corner and smoked the kind of expensive tobacco from the halfling area. Maybe it was because he had killed too many people recently. Soren felt that the pressure on him was much greater than in the past. He was used to bloody killings and he was a little tired. He needed to relax a little and numb his spirit. After all, it was really uncomfortable to be too tense. Even a strong man would be tired sometimes. Soren did not drink. He almost did not touch alcohol, so he could only smoke some tobacco. No one nearby dared to disturb him. The thugs outside drove away other people who wanted to enter the tavern. Soren had more than 1,000 pirates under his command, but there were only 300 people who were completely under his command. After all, he could not break up all the small groups of pirates who came to him. It was easy to have a rebound effect. Soren only accepted the allegiance of those small pirate leaders. In layman's terms, Soren was the boss of the whole south coast, and there were many small leaders who came to him. He ordered the small leaders to control the minions. It would be difficult to control them too strictly. After all, the pirates themselves were a little special. The other pirate kings were the same. There were many people they could influence, but the only ones they could really pull out were their trusted subordinates. Time ticked by. Soren seemed to be waiting for someone. He was very patient and there was no anxiety at all. After about half an hour, a young man who was obviously a half-elf came in. He was the first mate promoted by Soren, and now he was in charge of a pirate ship alone. Behind him was a guy who was about 30 years old. He looked a little shifty, but his eyes were very clever. This guy's fingers moved from time to time, and his wrist and fingers were very flexible. With just a glance, Soren knew that he was a rogue, and a rogue who specialized in stealing. This kind of person was more shrewd. Your Excellency. The first mate bowed slightly and said, "It's him." Soren nodded and looked at the thief in front of him. The thief was a little afraid of his eyes, so he quickly bowed and said, "Your Excellency Throat Cutter. I don't know what I can do for you." Soren narrowed his eyes slightly. There was a trace of killing intent in his eyes, and there was also a special pressure. That was the effect of fear gaze. The wretched thief in front of him seemed a little scared. There was a trace of cold sweat on his forehead, but he still stood in front of him. This guy was still a little brave. Soren nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, "What's your name?" The wretched man in front of him quickly bowed his head and said, "My name is Slanik. They like to call me Skinny Monkey." Soren frowned slightly and said, "From today onwards, you are responsible for collecting all useful information on the mainland. I will specifically mobilize manpower and resources for you. No matter if it is useful or not, as long as there is any major news on the mainland, you will send it all to me. The manpower is mainly distributed in Shipwreck Bay, the City of Wealth, and Port Tylon. This is the core area that connects the mainland and the Gulf Islands. A lot of information will flow from here. Your task is to disperse the manpower and deliver important news regularly." "No problem, right?" The wretched guy in front of him couldn't help but show a hint of surprise on his face. His expression seemed to be a little excited and he murmured, I will live up to your expectations." Even if he was an idiot, he could understand that he was promoted by His Excellency Throat Cutter in front of him. Perhaps it was not a very important position, but just from His Excellency's instructions he could manage a lot of people in the future. From Shipwreck Bay to the City of Wealth, and then extended to Port Tylon. His Excellency intended to let him establish a simple intelligence network. As for why His Excellency was interested in those rumors, rather than collecting information on the fat sheep at sea, who could care so much at this time? The wretched man in front of him was very clear about one thing, that was, if he did his job well this time, he would be the confidant of His Excellency Throat Cutter. Almost all the pirates who were promoted now were those who had followed him in battle, especially those who had participated in the battle against the Swamp King. Almost all of them were now at the level of a small leader. In terms of rewards, His Excellency was very generous. Many of those small leaders had one or two ships in their hands. Soren said a few words to the first mate next to him, and then let him lead the skinny monkey in front of him away. Some things were so wonderful. Before the battle against the Swamp King, Soren did not have many trustworthy people, and there were no particularly loyal guys. But after the battle against the Swamp King, he could use a lot of people, especially those who survived the battle. These guys thought that they had helped Soren defeat the Swamp King. They were the kind of trusted subordinates who had merits, and their loyalty automatically rose. Many people's minds changed like this. At first, they were afraid of Soren, thinking that his excellency was a terrifying existence, and there was little loyalty to speak of. They mainly relied on fear to control them. But after the battle with the Swamp King, they changed their minds. I've also contributed. I've worked hard for His Excellency. No matter how cruel His Excellency is, he can't casually punish people who have worked hard for him, right? I have worked hard for His Excellency. If he wants to promote me in the future, I will definitely have a share, right? His Excellency seems to be a person who pays attention to the rules. I have worked hard for His Excellency, so I should be more trusted than those guys, right? Things were that simple. The group of subordinates who had experienced the battle against the Swamp King automatically changed their mentality to that of Soren's trusted subordinates. Then their loyalty began to rise on its own. Why did this happen? Maybe this was the power of human nature and power. Just like when you did something for Your Excellency and it was something very important, you would consciously think that you have gained extra points in Your Excellency's eyes. Similarly, you would begin to think that Your Excellency was more important than before. The fear in their hearts decreased and the respect in their hearts increased. Their views began to change, and then it was natural for them to be promoted. These guys quickly changed their mentality to that of Soren's trusted subordinates. So, a lot of things were really interesting. Sometimes you should give your subordinates more opportunities to work hard. After they worked hard, they would have a sense of identity. For example, the first mate in front of him. When he was promoted by Soren, at most he had respect in his eyes. But after experiencing the battle against the Swamp King, his loyalty could be said to be the highest among all of them. He looked at Soren with a trace of fanaticism and worship in his eyes. He thought that he had contributed to the defeat of the Swamp King, and at the same time he thought that he should be Soren's #1 fighter. His status was even higher than that of the red-haired female pirate Adele Isabella who had followed Soren in the beginning. I helped His Excellency defeat the Swamp King. I proved my loyalty to His Excellency, so my status should be higher than that woman's. Even if I am temporarily lower than her, as long as I have a chance to show my strength and loyalty, sooner or later I can replace that woman and become His Excellency's most trusted helper. This mentality was actually very common among Soren's subordinates. Because the rise of a new pirate king also meant that many positions were vacant. The pirate king was not a commander without an army. Most of them controlled a lot of trade in the sea. Among these positions, there were at least hundreds of people who could be promoted. Now many people were eager to show off their abilities. The most obvious ones were the surviving pirates. Their strength was not bad, and they all thought that they had the ability to fight for the qualifications of a leader. All of them were looking for opportunities to further show off their abilities. Soon it was noon. Soren put away his pipe, his fingers gently tapping on the table, as if he was waiting for someone to come. A maid next to him carefully brought him a bowl of exquisite food. When she put down the food, she deliberately showed her white cleavage in front of Soren. But Soren just glanced at it indifferently, then reached out and took a bite of the bread. Power was a man's best partner. With power, this group of women might not necessarily flock to him like moths to a flame, but with power, there were always many women who tried to seduce him. Soren was not without desire, but he thought that it was not time yet. Now was not the time to relax and enjoy. About an hour later, a red-haired female pirate in tight leather clothes came in. She quickly walked in front of Soren, bent down slightly, revealing a pair of full white breasts, and whispered, "Your Excellency, the things you ordered have been prepared. Food, medicine, weapons, and so on, we have prepared enough. At the same time, we also used our influence to borrow some of the cargo ships of other chambers of commerce. The people in charge of 6 chambers of commerce said that as long as you take care of them in the future, they are willing to collect these materials for free and send them to the places you want to send them to." Soren was a pirate king. What was a pirate king? It was a person who specialized in robbing these merchants or collecting protection fees. It wasn't that these chambers of commerce didn't have the strength, but their guards simply couldn't beat these fierce pirates at sea. The guards of the chambers of commerce needed compensation if they died, and there were not many who were willing to fight, so most of the time, they spent money to buy safety. Almost every pirate king had a certain influence on the trade in the nearby sea, and the pirate king also controlled the sale of stolen goods in the entire sea. They flattered Soren not only to protect and take care of him, but they also wanted to use the power of Soren to fight against competitors, or buy stolen goods at a low price and sell them. Not many of these merchants who engaged in cross-sea trade were clean people. Soren reached out and took a look at a list, then nodded gently, "Not bad. Let them prepare all the materials, I will need them soon." "Right. What about the slaves I need? How are the preparations?" The gorgeous red-haired female pirate could not help but show a trace of embarrassment on her face, and whispered, "At present only a small part of it is enough. Some time ago the mine in the City of Wealth collapsed, causing the demand for slaves on the market to increase. Because what you need is a strong labor force, there are not enough people at present. But as long as you give me a little time, I promise to complete your task." Slaves. A crucial part of Soren's plan. He decided to develop in the outer islands, and this cheap labor force was almost indispensable. And because of the manor economy on the south coast as well as the needs of various mines, the slave trade in this area was more vigorous than in other places. The mines controlled by the aristocrats were absolutely unwilling to hire civilians to work. They would try their best to get slaves and criminals to work, which could greatly reduce the cost of personnel. In these mines, it was definitely a very dark and bloody place. There was almost no law in it. When there was a lack of labor, not to mention slaves, even civilians could be caught to work until they died. This point was basically needless to say, because even in the 21st century, there was still a lot of darkness in the mines. Soren frowned slightly when he heard this. He glanced at Adele in front of him and noticed that she seemed a little nervous. Because she did not participate in the battle to defeat the Swamp King, during this time, many people wanted to challenge her position in front of Soren, ready to prove their value beyond this woman in front of him, so she was a little nervous. This woman had now recovered her father's strength, and could be regarded as a pirate leader, but she obviously did not want to lose her value in Soren's eyes. Her current position was second only to Soren, and this woman naturally did not want to be pushed down by others. So now she always wanted to improve her position in Soren's eyes, and to this end she used a little trick. The most obvious point was, she basically did not use makeup in the past, but now every time she saw Soren she would put on a little makeup on her face. The meaning of this was self-evident. Soren frowned and pondered for a moment, then said, "Get this done as soon as possible. I will have a new arrangement in a week at most. Let them send the goods to Snake Island, leave a group of people to guard it, and then recruit people from the coastal areas." He paused for a moment, then continued, "Use the name of the Chamber of Commerce, no need for combat power, just adult labor is enough." Adult labor? Adele did not dare to think too much and quickly said, "Yes. I'll arrange it right away." The red-haired female pirate looked hesitant before leaving. She looked back at Soren, not knowing what she was thinking, and her face turned slightly red. Sea Temple. The Naga Siren priest frowned and sat at the back of the hall. She looked at a human man in front of her and wondered, so many materials? Is he still preparing slaves? Is he preparing to expand overseas? The person in front of her did not answer, but stayed quietly in place. The Naga Siren priest waved her hand gently and said, "Go down. Continue to pay attention to his movements. I'm more and more curious about what he wants to do." Expand overseas. It was not that no one had done this before, but the indigenous people in the overseas areas were very xenophobic, coupled with the harsh living environment and all kinds of dangerous creatures. Most of the pioneers eventually failed. Because it was difficult to survive in the outer islands, population transfer was a big problem. All kinds of diseases, monsters, and enemies could even defeat professionals, and it was even more difficult for ordinary people to survive there. Without ordinary people as a foundation, it was basically impossible to talk about expanding overseas. Not to mention, there were covetous Amazons and indigenous people with a strong sense of territory. She was curious about how Soren could stand firm. In the room, Soren spread out a nautical map and observed. The area of the outer islands was very large, but there were very few places suitable for development. Because there were too many monsters, enemies, and dangerous environments, combined with all kinds of needs, greatly increasing the difficulty of development. However, Soren had an advantage, that was, he knew which areas had been developed by people who had developed port towns. These locations were selected by a lot of manpower and material resources in the past. Basically, there were natural ports as well as various terrain advantages, plus the surrounding environmental factors. For example, whether there were strong enemies, whether there were any resources, whether it was suitable for farming crops and so on. Many people failed to expand overseas at the beginning. However, there were also some people who were successful. These people were successful because they found some very good geographical locations. Soren was now trying to remember the best piece of land. Chapter 240. Adjusted my state, quit smoking, got up very early today and I feel very energetic. Today I'm even better. It was a little stuffy in the room. Soren looked at the nautical chart for a while, stood up, and then opened the window to let the cold wind blow. Finding a suitable development point was not an easy task, because many large guilds with tens of thousands of people had failed to develop overseas. These were all professionals, and because they were reincarnated into the river Styx after 3 deaths, their mentality was more unafraid of death than the original inhabitants, but even so many failed. One can imagine how difficult it was to develop overseas. This was only one of the difficulties, because Soren not only wanted to develop overseas, but also take this opportunity to grow stronger to cope with the arrival of the Avatar crisis. So the geographical location he had to choose was even more special. Not only did he have to deliberately avoid a large number of indigenous people, but he also had to avoid the sphere of influence of the Amazons. Otherwise, these 2 powerful forces would not allow him to rise. Even if he had the identity of one of the 3 pirate kings, it might not be useful because pirates could not defeat the army on land. The cold wind blew for a while. Soren waved his hand and ordered a maid to bring in a basin of water. He washed his face and moved a little, and then began to continue to observe the nautical chart, marking out the location of the port of the town that was successfully built by resisting the attack of the indigenous people in his memory. These places had inherent advantages and 1 or 2 of them had mineral advantages. Although Soren did not have long-term overseas activities, he was still quite impressed by the location of the town that was successfully built at that time. Here. And here. Soren took a quill pen and made some changes. 7 or 8 locations had been marked on the nautical chart, which were basically on the coastline, and many of them were relatively remote. Don't underestimate the nautical chart in his hand. The value of this thing was actually quite amazing. There was no satellite positioning in this world and nautical charts were drawn manually bit by bit. Perhaps for Soren, one of the new pirate kings, this nautical chart was just an order, but for others, especially those merchants who ran sea transportation, this nautical chart was worth thousands of gold. The topography of the Gulf Islands and various safe routes were drawn on the map. At the same time, it also recorded the pirates' exploration of the deep sea over the past hundreds of years, as well as the distribution of dangerous creatures in the nearby waters. At the same time, it also recorded the activities of a small number of marine intelligent creatures. It could be said that merchants would be willing to buy this nautical chart for 5,000 Kindler coins. Naturally, Soren wouldn't sell it. In this era, information was a shocking wealth. If he wanted to monopolize the interests of the outer islands, how could he let others get involved in the exploration? At present, the entire overseas trade of the south coast was done with the Amazon region. They were dealing with the Amazon women, so their profits were only about 3 times. However, if they could trade with the indigenous people, then the profits of the trade could reach 5 or even 10 times more. Some simple trinkets could be exchanged for gold from the indigenous people. Clang, clang. There was a light knock on the door. The person outside seemed to be very cautious. He knew that Soren was thinking about something important and was afraid of interrupting his train of thought. Come in. Soren put down the quill and turned around. How's it going? The person who came in was a strong man with a scar on his face. There was a scar on the side of his face, a scar on his forehead and a scar on his chin. Just by looking at him, one could feel that this guy was very fierce and had a lot of combat experience. His nickname was Scarface. He participated in the battle where Soren killed the Swamp King. He was also a pirate leader who was promoted later on. He controlled a large ship and 2 small ships and recruited about 70 to 80 men. Soren had recently been expanding the scale of the pirates. He had roped in all sorts of gangsters from all walks of life. Currently, he had close to 1,500 pirates under his command. Among them, there were about 500 to 600 who were directly under his command. In this world, there was no way to pull out thousands of people because ordinary civilians weren't very useful. Soren's men had at least 5 years of militia training. Even the weakest of these thugs could take down 3 ordinary adult men with their bare hands. As for the high-grade professions, it was better not to think too much. In this world, the high-grade professions were the managers of a force. The worst was at least the level of a small leader. Soren only had 2 4th-grade professions under him. The rest were at most level 12, which was about the strength of the third grade. At present he hadn't recruited any spellcasters. The spellcasters were usually very arrogant and it wasn't easy to meet them. Therefore Soren didn't have much hope for them. There were many ways for spellcasters to make money. It was basically impossible to rely on a pirate force because it was too dangerous to be a pirate. Your Excellency. Scarface carefully handed over a stack of scrolls and said in a deep voice, I specially brought people to the City of Wealth and bought these from the secret shop according to your instructions. There are a total of 27 scrolls. The wizard in the shop said that you can get a discount if you want so many scrolls at once. In total, you spent 26,500 Kindler coins. Speaking of this, Scarface wiped the sweat on his forehead and continued, the batch of goods from Snake Island has been sold. That group of cunning merchants was willing to take the initiative to raise the purchase price a little because they feared your Excellency's reputation. They bought the goods at 50% of the market price. So this time, we also brought back 21,500 Kindler coins. He carefully handed over a list and then couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. That was a lot of money. 20 Kindler coins were 1 pound. 20,000 Kindler coins were 1,000 pounds of gold. He had never seen such a large amount of money before. If it weren't for the fact that he was in awe of Soren's ruthlessness, he even wanted to secretly pocket some of it. However, this idea only appeared for a moment, and then he gave up the idea because Soren was now one of the 3 pirate kings. He thought that serving under Soren would have a better future, and there was no need to lower his position in His Excellency's heart because of this. Last time there was a person who secretly pocketed goods. After being found out by His Excellency, he was directly hanged on the mast. Very good. Soren picked up the list and glanced at it, then glanced at the thin man behind Scarface. The guy shook his head slightly. Soren's face showed a smile and said, You did a good job. Take someone to get 500 Kindler coins. This is a reward for you. Go out and have some fun and relax. We'll be going to sea in a while. Naturally, he wouldn't let his men do as they pleased. Every leader had his eyes. If Soren were to expand overseas, his connection with the mainland would inevitably weaken, so he needed to prepare a lot of things, including the magic scrolls he would need to learn in the future. These things were too expensive. They often cost hundreds of Kindler coins. High-grade magic scrolls above the 5th circle sometimes cost 7,000 or 8,000 Kindler coins. Although Soren was rich, he didn't have so much money that he could buy whatever he wanted. It wasn't easy to transfer around 30,000 Kindler coins to buy magic scrolls. Unless he completely gave up on the south coast, he would have to transfer funds to maintain the situation. This batch of magic scrolls was enough to last for a while. Soren didn't have the energy to buy any rare equipment for the time being because it was too rare and too expensive. Because he needed to cast spells, he didn't even wear leather armor. His need for other equipment was mainly focused on the most expensive rings, jewelry, accessories, belts, and so on. This kind of equipment often cost thousands of Kindler coins, and it was quite difficult to buy them. He didn't have so much money and time now. You don't have to worry about not having enough money. This was the coastal area. If you went to the wizard city, you could find a wizard on the street who was worth tens of thousands of Kindler coins. Some of the more powerful wizards were worth hundreds of thousands of Kindler coins. If you went shopping in the wizard city, even if it was 1,000,000 Kindler coins, you could spend it all in minutes. One wizard tower. Soren naturally didn't have the ability to go to the wizard city to spend money, so he didn't think about buying those legendary equipment with frightening prices for the time being. When Scarface heard Soren's reward, he couldn't help but show a hint of surprise. Although 500 Kindler coins wasn't a lot, it was still a small fortune for him. He could casually send 100 or 200 Kindler coins to his subordinates, then take them to drink and play with women. In the end, he could still swallow 200 or 300 Kindler coins himself. In the pirate industry, the boss ate the meat and the underlings drank the soup. The underlings lived a drunken life. As long as they had wine, meat, and a little money to find women, it was enough. He nodded respectfully and was ready to turn around and leave. Soren put down the shipping bill and glanced at the map. He frowned and said, Go and see One-Eyed Jack later. Ask him why the batch of exquisitely forged military weapons I need hasn't been delivered yet. Tell him that he must deliver it within 3 days, or throw him into the sea to feed the sharks. Scarface stopped when he heard this, then turned his head with a smirk on his face. He stuck out his tongue and licked his lips. Your Excellency, don't worry. I'll go and see right away. I promise that the weapons will be delivered within 3 days. Soren nodded with satisfaction and waved his hand. Very good. You can go. Yes. Scarface nodded respectfully. The strength of Soren's pirates was still a little weak. Although many pirates had good combat experience and were very brave when fighting, after all, they lacked accumulation. It was necessary to rely on equipment to improve their combat strength. This batch of exquisitely forged military weapons was very important. Chapter 241. Time ticked by. Soren frowned as he stared at the nautical chart. He then picked up a quill and began to draw on it. Not here. Not here. There are monsters here. The natives here are too strong. There are only 2 places left. 5 or 6 positions were crossed in a row, and there were only 2 positions left in front of Soren. Although these 2 places weren't the best, they should be the easiest places to build a town. Soren didn't have thousands of professionals under his command. In other words, he couldn't even compare to the small and medium-sized guilds in his previous life. After all, most of the people who explored the sea were Tier 3. Soren's subordinates who were Tier 3 and above were all pirate leaders. His only advantage was his high combat power. With his and Vivian's strength, they could easily crush ordinary enemies. Island, sea route, natural port, coastal location. Exploring the sea wasn't something that could be done by just drawing a map. That was a suicidal act. This world was relatively barren. Although there were things that could do the same thing as excavators, they had to be top-notch in terms of combat power. Otherwise, they would have to rely on wizard spells such as stone to mud, and mud to stone. Soren's core development depended on sea trade, so a natural port was a necessary part. The location must be near the sea to facilitate transportation. Next was the sea route. The sea route must be relatively safe and avoid dangerous areas. It would be best if there were islands or transit stations nearby to replenish fresh water. After all, it would take 7 to 8 days to cross the sea. After all, the outer islands were still in the sea. A round trip would take at least half a month. Looks like I can only go to both places. Soren put away the nautical chart and was about to get up and look at other things. But at this time there was a rush of footsteps outside. Then a maid ran over and said intermittently, "Sir, sir." She woke up. Soren was stunned when he heard this. Then he showed a hint of surprise. Soren didn't care about anything else. He didn't even go through the door and directly jumped out of the window. Then he turned into a blur and rushed toward the room in the courtyard. "Brother." As soon as Soren entered the room, Vivian called out to him. However, her expression seemed to be a little tired. She sat up on the bed and rubbed the corners of her eyes with her small white hands. As if she was still half asleep, she asked, "How long have I been sleeping?" He felt like he had slept for a long time again. 5 days. Soren looked at her carefully and asked, "Vivian, how do you feel?" The little girl raised her small hand to cover her mouth and murmured, "I actually slept for so long again?" "I don't know either. I just feel a little tired and want to sleep again." "Still want to sleep." Soren's expression froze for a moment before he whispered, "Are you dreaming?" What did he dream of? Dream? The little girl seemed to have remembered something. Her cute little face showed a look of reminiscence. She even bit her finger a little. After Soren frowned and removed her finger from her mouth, she stuck out her tongue. The little girl sometimes bit her finger. This habit occasionally appeared. She tilted her head and murmured, "I dreamed of a monster that looked like a giant octopus." "Brother. That giant octopus was so hard to kill. I smashed it into pieces, but I still couldn't kill it completely." "Oh." "In the end there was no other way. I could only roast it and eat it." "Eat it?" Soren's expression was a little silly, but he quickly recovered. The dream was just the evolution of the battle between the divine will. Vivian didn't really eat a trace of Dagon's divine will. Instead, it evolved into the dream of eating it during the process of devouring it. However, it seemed that the little girl had indeed grown a lot. From the point that she could fuse with external divinities, her potential was really unpredictable. How much divinity did the Swamp King have? According to Soren's estimation and the results of the data analysis, the Swamp King's divinity should not be as high as that of the Son of Fear. After all, the latter had the bloodline of the Son of Fear. The Swamp King just received a trace of divinity in the blasphemy ceremony of the ultimate abyssal demon lord, Dagon. Therefore, if the Son of Fear's divinity value was about 3 points, then the Swamp King's divinity value must be below 3 points. It was just that it had lived longer and its strength was higher than that of the Son of Fear. Then, the Swamp King's divinity value should be about 1 to 2 points, and the possibility of 2 points was very high. Vivian used less than a week to complete the fusion of 2 points of divinity. This speed was not slower than many demigods. Even if someone succeeded in killing a god in the future, the speed of absorbing and fusing divinity would definitely not be faster than her. Divinity was the most difficult part of the divine power to fuse because this power was difficult to be deprived. But other divine powers, such as the Shard of Divinity, were easy to fuse. In the future, many new gods relied on the Shard of Divinity to ascend. Their divinity was at most the level of lesser divinity. The Shard of Divinity was a power that was easy to control. As long as you killed a saint who was the incarnation of a god, you could get a part of the Shard of Divinity. If you mastered some special abilities or even understood the power of the laws of the gods, then you could get a complete Shard of Divinity. In Soren's memory, there was a person who fused with lesser divine power once. The so-called lesser divine power was the lesser Shard of Divinity, and divine power was just the energy stored inside the Shard of Divinity. Most of the divine power level referred to the Shard of Divinity. Because divine power was a power value, after the prayers of believers were converted into divine power value, this divine power value was the same as the mana value after the collapse of the magic net. Vivian couldn't help but stretch after she finished speaking. The little girl stretched her little arms and legs, then she crawled into Soren's arms like a cat. Her little head rubbed against Soren's chest, then she closed her eyes again and fell asleep in just a few seconds. It seemed that she had used up too much energy to defeat the ancient Abyss Lord, Dagon, as divine consciousness. She actually fell asleep so quickly. This time, Soren felt a lot more at ease because Vivian was not in danger now. She was just too tired after the spiritual battle. This sleep lasted for another 2 days. When the little girl woke up from her exhaustion, Soren had already arranged everything and was ready to leave for the outer islands. Soren did a lot of preparation work for this trip to the outer islands, including food and medicine on 2 ships, weapons and tools on 1 ship, and about 300 slaves. Some of these slaves came from the mainland, some from the outer islands, and some were even the children of the slaves. Although Soren's plan required a large number of slaves to realize, the first step of development was not to bring too many slaves because they needed to consume food and manpower to manage them. If there were any diseases or accidents, these slaves would die one by one, and Soren would suffer a great loss. This was the first batch of slaves. As Soren's coolies to develop the outer islands, he would only send the second batch of slaves after the development of the outer islands was successful. For this operation, Soren mobilized a total of 3 large warships, 3 large cargo ships and a ghost ship. However, the ghost ship was hidden at the bottom of the sea, and other people basically did not know the existence of this ship. Soren did not intend to spread the news of him controlling the ghost ship. Only the pirates who had experienced the battle with the Swamp King would occasionally say that they saw His Excellency Throat Cutter summoning the ghost ship. Anyway, this thing should be kept a little mysterious. Poor Tylon. Soren stood on the bow of the ship and looked into the distance, and then ordered the fleet to set off. With the command of his men, 6 large ships set sail. There were many observers near the dock. Some were curious, some were happy, some were relaxed, and some were gloating. Anyway, many people were curious about Soren's fleet to go to the outer islands. In this regard, Soren did not care at all. Because whether or not he could rise in the future in the Avatar crisis depended on whether or not he could achieve something with this vote. Chapter 242. On the 3rd day of quitting smoking, I coughed up thick phlegm in the morning. It was very uncomfortable. Today it's even worse. Under the blue sky. Soren looked a little thin but full of strength as he stood on the Dragonhead warship. He held a curved sword in each hand and his body was slightly squatted down like a taut bowstring. He seemed to be listening to something with his back facing the others. Behind him was Adele Isabella, who was moving at high speed. The red-haired female pirate was also holding a sword in both hands. She constantly changed her position around Soren, as if looking for his flaws and opportunities to attack. Time passed little by little. As if she felt that there were no obvious flaws, the red-haired female pirate shouted and rushed over. At the same time, she waved her 2 swords and slashed towards Soren's shoulder. The other sword directly slashed towards his throat. Dang dang dang. Soren made his move in an instant. The curved sword in his hand turned into a cold light, blocking Adele Isabella's attack. At the same time he slashed back. The opponent had dodged with an unusually agile speed, and at the same time, slashed towards Soren's abdomen. At this time, Soren's movements seemed to be a little slow. Not only did the red-haired female pirate slash his abdomen, but it also tore his clothes and made a bloody mark. But he did not hesitate. Almost after being attacked by the opponent, he immediately rolled and dodged. At the same time he slashed towards Adele Isabella's ankle. Dang dang dang. Continuous parries sounded. Soren took 3 steps back and another bloody mark appeared on his shoulder. On the other side of the warship, a man with a scar on the side of his face watched the battle on the Dragonhead warship not far away. His expression was a little surprised and puzzled. "Your Excellency, are you going easy on that woman?" Otherwise, with his Excellency throat cutter skills, how could he not even beat that bad-tempered woman? "I don't think that woman is much stronger than us, right?" This was a pirate leader. Soren picked out the good fighters from the surviving men and promoted them to the level of a small pirate leader. No. Standing next to him was a half-elf. The half-elf was also watching the battle on the Dragonhead warship. He said lightly, "His Excellency throat cutter didn't let Adele Isabella win. How is this possible?" The scarred man who asked the question first said, "Don't think that I can't understand anything just because I'm not as good as you. In any case, I participated in the battle against the Swamp King and killed 5 enemies with my own hands. The strength of His Excellency throat cutter is not something that the red-haired woman can handle. If he didn't let her go, I'm afraid that woman would be defeated within 3 moves." The half-elf glanced at him and calmly said, "Your Excellency did not let her win. It's just that you've been fighting with your eyes closed." Fight with his eyes closed? Hearing the half-elf's words, the other pirate leaders nearby couldn't help but quiet down. Then one by one they looked over there. There was still a lot of distance between the 2 ships. Others only saw Soren fighting with the red-haired female pirate, but they couldn't see that Soren had been fighting with his eyes closed. Only the half-elf's first mate had sharper eyes. He saw that Soren had never opened his eyes from beginning to end. He's really fighting with his eyes closed. A bald pirate with a fierce face scratched his scalp with a hook and said incredulously, "His Excellency throat cutter is so powerful with his eyes closed. Is he training some powerful combat skills?" No one answered, because others couldn't understand why Soren was fighting with Adele Isabella with his eyes closed. Dang dang dang. It was yet another round of confrontation. As Adele Isabella's round of continuous attacks ended, the 2 of them could not help but distance themselves. The red-haired female pirate noticed that Soren made a gesture, so she immediately stopped her plan to continue attacking. She stood in front of Soren and waited quietly. This was the 3rd time this kind of combat training, and the man in front of her actually wanted to fight with her with his eyes closed. At first she thought he was joking, but later she realized that he was serious. And he really had the ability to fight with her with his eyes closed. Blind battle. Soren took a breath and slowly opened his eyes. He glanced at the red-haired female pirate in front of him, then nodded slightly and said, "That's it for today." After that, he picked up a towel and wiped the sweat and blood on his body. The battle was for real. Soren did have wounds on his body, but they were not that serious. He was a person who believed in actual combat experience. Training could only be improved the most in actual combat. As for the injuries on his body, it was a small matter. Anyway, he also had a very strong regeneration ability. It would take 5 or 6 days for the fleet to reach the Kelp Islands. He was not going to waste this time. Every day he would fight with the red-haired female pirate regularly to train his other abilities. Because Soren had obtained a lot of information during this period of time. A row of data appeared in front of him. Combat experience. You have successfully launched a special combat skill. You have learned something in battle. In training you have mastered new combat skills. You have obtained some information about sword form, spinning strike. Combat experience. With combat training your combat skills have gradually improved. You have obtained some information about dual-wielding defense. Combat experience. With combat at sea your combat ability in the sea environment has improved, and your ability to balance against the bumps of the ship has improved. You have obtained some information about sea combat. Combat experience. Through the repeated training, you've comprehended a unique combat technique. You have learned the ability, dual wielding. Combat experience. As you train and temper yourself, you've grasped some special combat techniques. You have obtained some information about the ability, blind battle. There were a total of 5 information prompts. Perhaps it was because Soren had recently been leaning towards accumulating strength. All the information about skills appeared in one breath today. The most important one was the ability, dual wielding. Soren had received this information prompt twice. In order to master this ability he had spent a lot of energy. Then there was the information prompt of sword form, spinning strike. This prompt appeared because Soren had carefully observed Adele Isabella's battle and learned the spinning strike technique she used. According to this progress, it should not take too long to learn it. Then there was the ability, dual-wielding defense. This ability had appeared once in the Battle of the Swamp King. It was an accident that it appeared now. Therefore, the main purpose of Soren's training this time was to master the ability, blind battle. In order to practice blind battle skills, he closed his eyes and fought. However, this also reduced his ability to grasp the enemy's position. He could not completely determine the enemy's position, so he had to turn to a defensive battle. He could find the enemy's position through the enemy's attack and then launch a counterattack. As a result, he did not expect to train the combat skill, dual-wielding defense. Soren did not receive the information prompt of blind battle, but he received its information prompt first. I finally mastered dual wielding. Soren looked at his own data display and could not help but let out a long sigh. After mastering dual wielding, I should be able to level up my profession and further strengthen my ability. Ability points were very precious. If time allowed, it was better to train the relatively simple basic abilities by himself and then use the ability points to level them up. Otherwise, it would be a waste to waste the ability points on those basic abilities. After all, some abilities could be mastered by oneself as the number of battles increased. Maybe it was because his combat experience was getting richer, or maybe it was because Soren's accumulation of experience had reached a certain level. Recently, the speed at which he received information prompts was obviously much faster than before, and the effect of training some basic abilities was very good. Phew. Just as Soren was about to take a break to level up his profession and then think about which ability to level up, there was a sudden commotion on the cargo ship next to him. It was followed by the shouts of the sailors and some chaotic noises. The noise made Soren frown. Then, he lightly jumped and directly landed on the deck of the ship. Something seemed to have happened here. Soren could only temporarily give up on leveling up his profession and come over to take a look. After all, there were no battles happening for the time being. What's going on? He landed on the deck and looked at the sailors in front of him. He said in a deep voice, "What happened? Why is it so noisy?" Hearing Soren's deep voice, the sailors on the cargo ship were obviously afraid and shrank back a little. The named throat cutter was now able to stop children from crying at night in the South Coast area. When he saw Soren, he was obviously a little scared. It was a brave sailor next to him who answered, "Your Excellency, throat cutter. Below. There's a slave down there who's sick. We're worried that it's a contagious disease. We're going to throw him into the sea, but a slave is protecting him and won't let us get close." Disease? When Soren heard this word, he couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. It wasn't a joke to encounter a disease while out at sea. Even a profession might not be able to withstand it sometimes. In the case of sailing at sea, contagious diseases were indeed a nightmare. It could eventually lead to the infection of the entire ship. Therefore, when encountering such a situation, most people would throw the infected person into the sea, especially the infected person among the slaves. In order to prevent all the slaves from being infected, they might even execute the infected slave. The medical skills in this world weren't very good. Doctors were good at sword wounds. In terms of treating diseases, other than magic, Drool was more proficient in herbs. Here. The most common treatment for illness was to resist it. If you could resist it, you would live. If you couldn't resist it, then there was no other way. Although priests could cure most diseases, ordinary people simply couldn't afford to pay the incomparably expensive price. Even the priests of good gods wouldn't help others without paying in return. There were too many people in this world who were suffering, and they simply couldn't help all of them. Take me to have a look. Soren was still quite concerned about this group of slaves. These slaves were the main labor force when he opened up the sea. If they all died of diseases at sea, then it would be really troublesome. As soon as his voice fell, a sailor beside him immediately bowed and let him down. The slaves were locked up in the cabin. As soon as Soren entered the cabin, he smelled a foul stench. He couldn't help but frown slightly. Then he saw a large group of slaves locked in cages. They were huddled together in a dark pile. The place where they slept was also filled with their own feces. The whole place was stinky. As slaves, their living conditions must be terrible. But in such an environment, it was no wonder that some of them fell sick. "Your Excellency." The supervisor who was dealing with this matter immediately bowed his head respectfully when he saw Soren. Then he lifted his leg and kicked the subordinate next to him. He smiled and said, "Sorry to disturb you, Your Excellency. I deserve to die. But there is a slave here who has a disease. I'm worried that he will infect others. Originally, I was going to throw him into the sea, but another slave said that his disease wasn't contagious. This lowly guy protected him and didn't let us go. In the end, we could only teach them a lesson. Since Your Excellency is here, Your Excellency, I would like to ask Your Excellency how to deal with them. These slaves were Soren's property. The supervisor in front of him was only helping him transport them. He was the person in charge of the Chamber of Commerce to please him. So when he saw Soren, he wanted to ask how to deal with these two slaves. Oh. A rather sturdy-looking male slave raised his head. He seemed to have some northern blood in him. He begged with a voice that was mixed with dialect, "Your Excellency, my brother doesn't have the plague. He's just a little uncomfortable. He definitely won't infect anyone else. I've already taken care of him for 3 days before boarding the ship. But it wasn't as serious as it is now. You see, I'm completely fine now. He won't infect anyone else. I beg you, don't throw him into the sea." Bang bang bang. The male slave, who looked like a northern, hurriedly kowtowed. His forehead was soon bleeding, but his arms were still tightly protecting the young man next to him. He seemed to be afraid that they would take the young man away and throw him into the sea. There were basically no doctors on the sea. At most, there would be someone who had learned medicine. There were very few ways to treat this kind of disease. Many times, when people encountered diseases on the sea, they could only use simple treatment and rely on their own body to resist it. Regarding the situation in front of him, Soren didn't have the slightest sympathy on his face. He wasn't a person who was overflowing with sympathy. He glanced at the northern slave in front of him indifferently, then motioned to the person next to him to pull him away. The slave seemed to be a little afraid of Soren, but he still hugged the young man next to him tightly. Soren glanced at him and saw the unconscious young man in his arms. The young slave's face was very pale, almost without a trace of blood. His breathing was also very weak. His lips were sickly red and he seemed to have a high fever. The surface of his skin was unnaturally dark green. "Take off his clothes." Soren frowned and looked at him, then ordered the others. The two sailors next to him hesitated for a moment, then carefully approached. The slave seemed to want to stop them, but he was directly kicked down. Then they stripped the sick slave of his clothes. When the slave took off his clothes, they were frightened and took a few steps back. This was because there were more than 10 fingernail-sized pustules on the slave's back. Some of these pustules had already rotted, revealing the dark yellow pus inside. There were other pustules like this on his body, but the size was not as obvious as the one on his back. Mang plague. The supervisor jumped up in fright and took 5 or 6 steps back. He stopped and shouted with a pale face, "Hurry up and throw him in. Send someone to get lime. Hurry up and sprinkle lime here. Hurry up. What are you waiting for? Hurry up and take that guy. No. Throw those 2 guys into the sea." The supervisor seemed to be frightened. After a while, he remembered that Soren was also here. He quickly bowed his head and wiped off his cold sweat. "Your Excellency, that slave seems to have Mang plague. It was a terrifying plague. This disease is contagious. Unless there is a priest who uses magic, ordinary medicine can't treat it at all. If you get this disease, your whole body will rot in the end and you'll die a horrible death." His words made the nearby sailors nervous, and they all looked at Soren in front of them. They seemed to be waiting for his order. On the other side, Vivian's petite figure came out of the cabin. She was wearing a snow-white princess dress. She raised her small hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes, then stretched her body. She looked at the red-haired female pirate next to her and asked, "Where's my brother? Why don't I see him?" "Your Excellency is on that ship," Adele replied, slightly bowed. As the #1 pirate leader under Soren, she naturally knew the position of the little girl in front of her in Soren's heart. Even the other pirate leaders knew that she was very important in the eyes of Soren. Therefore, no one dared to neglect her, not to mention that when Vivian occasionally used magic, she would make them feel unfathomable. "Over there?" The little girl looked up at the sun, then tied up her hair. Her lips moved slightly, and her small body flew up and landed directly on the deck of the opposite cargo ship. At this time, she just heard crying and pleading from below the cabin. Chapter 243. This is the 4th day of quitting smoking. I'm currently in the state of smoking cessation syndrome. It's quite uncomfortable. I clench my teeth and continue to persevere. Today there are 2 more. Mang disease? Soren's expression was not very good. He was not very clear about the diseases in this world because professionals had a strong resistance, especially non-supernatural diseases. Many professions were even completely immune to disease. Soren had 20 points of vitality in the past and now, which meant that the possibility of him contracting diseases was very low, so he did not pay much attention to the diseases in this world. However, he could ignore most of the diseases, but ordinary people in low-level professions would have a hard time. The young man in front of him was actually very seriously ill. He was clearly in a daze due to the fever. From the condition of his body and the spots of pustules on his back, Soren felt that this disease was a bit like the legendary smallpox. In fact, he had never seen smallpox before, nor had he contracted a similar disease. However, he had learned about smallpox in the past. This is a very serious disease belonging to a type of pox virus. After infection, the main symptoms are severe toxemia, chills, high fever, fatigue, headache, sore limbs, waist and back, convulsions and coma when the body temperature rises sharply. Patches, papules, herpes and pustules will appear on the skin in batches, and finally scabs and acne scars will be left. Smallpox was a highly contagious disease. The mortality rate for those who were not immunized was as high as 30%. Soren remembered the smallpox virus. Because this virus occupied a large part of history, his memory of the symptoms of smallpox was still relatively clear. The young slave in front of him had a disease that was similar to smallpox. However, the disease was concentrated on his back and limbs, and did not grow to his face. At the same time, when the disease reached the stage of herpes, it would directly become pustules. From the current situation, the disease on his body was more severe than smallpox. This was because smallpox had an incubation period, after which it would gradually become more serious. But this group of slaves had only been on the ship for 2 days. All the slaves had undergone a simple inspection before they were shipped, just in case some of them were infected and spread the disease to others. However, it had only been 2 days, and the symptoms on his body had already started to show pustules that were beginning to rot. The situation did not seem optimistic. Everyone turned their attention to Soren. The slave who stopped the others from approaching the sick man realized that Soren was the one who would decide his brother's fate. He quickly knelt on the ground and kowtowed, begging, "Your Excellency! Master! I beg you, please save my brother. He really didn't have a contagious disease. Please don't throw him into the sea." Time ticked by. Soren pondered for about half a minute before he raised his head and said expressionlessly, "Throw the infected one into the sea." He ordered people to disinfect the entire place. Also, the person who was taking care of him was locked up alone to prevent him from infecting others. Let the slaves clean up the inside and prepare some boiling water for them. Everyone in the back must pay attention. If anyone else shows the same symptoms, inform me immediately. This illness seemed to be very troublesome. If it was really a virus similar to smallpox, then it would be a nightmare. Soren could not risk the lives of the entire fleet for a slave, so he thought for a moment and decided to deal with them in the most rational way. Following his order, the sailors on both sides quickly approached and prepared to throw the young man into the sea. Bang! The slave who seemed to be his brother tried to push the sailors away, but one of them directly punched him until he bent down. He seemed to have some combat experience and his body was relatively strong. He did not fall down even after taking a hit, and he still stood in front of the unconscious young man. The nearby slaves looked on coldly. Many of them had fear and disgust in their eyes. Although they were slaves of the lowest status, they did not want to give up their lives. It was better to live than to die. "Brother?" At this moment, a clear child's voice sounded in the cabin. Vivian was wearing a snow-white princess dress. Her hair was tied into a single ponytail with a pink ribbon. She also wore a delicate pin on her chest. She then skipped down to the stinky cabin. As soon as she came in, the little girl could not help but cover her nose. She then put down her little hand naturally and smiled at Soren. She then ran over to him. She used to live in the slums, so she was able to adapt to the stench and filth of the environment. Vivian descended like a little angel, and a ray of light appeared in the dark and stinky cabin. The others could not help but stare at her blankly. She then came to Soren's side and raised her small hand to hold Soren's finger. She then frowned slightly and said with a clear child's voice, "Brother? What happened to them? Is that person sick? He looks so pitiful." Soren held Vivian's little hand and then took a step back to protect her. Although the little girl was a child of fear and there was basically no possibility of her getting sick, Soren was still a little worried and did not let her get too close to the sick slave in front of her. The little girl tilted her head and glanced at him, then said, "It looks like he's really sick? What are they going to do? I just heard that they were going to throw him into the sea." "Brother, I seem to be able to cure his illness. Otherwise they wouldn't have thrown him into the sea, right? As soon as Vivian's voice fell, the male slave who had been protecting the sick slave knelt down and then kowtowed desperately, begging her to save his brother. He now seemed to be holding the last life-saving straw. He did not even think that the little girl in front of him looked like she was only 8 or 9 years old. When the others heard this, they could not help but be stunned, especially the slaves in the cages. At this moment, they could not help but look at Vivian, who was like a little angel descending. Save him? Soren was stunned when he heard this. He looked down at the little girl in front of him and whispered, "Vivian, can you cure his illness?" Wizards did not seem to have any spells to cure diseases. That was a spell that only priests could master. There was a level 1 spell called Disease Suppression, which could delay the outbreak of the disease for 24 hours, but there was still no way to cure it. When wizards treated diseases, they also needed other potions. Necromancers studied diseases, but many of them did not seem to get sick at all. Soren really did not know that Vivian could cure diseases before. Stupid Vivian. Just when Vivian was about to treat the sick slave in front of her, Lillian's dissatisfied voice sounded in her mind. "What are you going to do? Just let that slave die. You want to use divine power to cast a divine spell to save him. Have you lost your mind? Divine power is so precious. Transforming it into a level 3 divine spell will consume a lot of it. What if we meet an enemy in the future? Don't mess around, bastard. That's my divine power. If I knew this would happen, I wouldn't have given you the right to use my divine power." Lillian was so angry that she stomped her feet. Unfortunately, she was not the one controlling the body today. The expression on Vivian's face was very calm, and there was a sweet smile on her adorable little face. Her expression didn't change at all, but she replied softly in her heart, "Lillian, it's okay. They look so pitiful. And casting a disease removal doesn't use much divine power." A strange light appeared. It was a light invisible to the naked eye and a pale golden light visible to the naked eye. The former appeared in Soren's eyes, while the latter was seen by the others. What Soren saw was Vivian casting a level 3 divine spell, disease removal, like an arcane spell. What the others saw was a pale golden light appearing on the little girl's white hand. The light revealed a sacred aura and power, and they could not help but feel awe as if they had seen a miracle. The power of magic was so powerful. As Vivian cast a disease removal on the young slave in front of her, the disease on his body began to recover rapidly, especially the pustules that gradually began to rot. They were almost healed at a speed visible to the naked eye. Although the power of magic could not fully restore his body, the disease on his body was completely cured. It was just that his body was weak because of the disease. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." The male slave in front of him looked at his younger brother, who was gradually waking up and regaining some color on his face. He immediately knelt down and kissed the ground under Vivian's feet. He did not dare to kiss the shoes of the angel-like little girl in front of him because he was afraid that he would profane her holiness. So, he could only kiss the ground under her feet to express his gratitude. The young man seemed to be gradually waking up. He looked at the others in front of him, and then was pulled by his older brother to kowtow several times. The matter seemed to have been resolved. Vivian's spell cured the sick slave, and even the air around him seemed to have been purified. The little girl smiled obediently, and then she held Soren's hand and left. She did not know the names of the 2 slaves. She simply felt sorry for them and wanted to help them because Vivian was actually a very kind little girl. The 2 quickly left the cabin, and the sailors began to arrange for people to clean up. The slaves were still locked in small cages, but they had just remembered an angel-like little girl. She was a very kind-hearted little girl. She was even willing to use a mysterious spell to save a lowly slave. Although she was not the one who saved them, her actions made them feel good and grateful. However, today was only the first time they saw the little girl. Chapter 244. On the warship. Soren held Vivian's small body and landed on the deck. Both of them didn't care too much about what just happened. In Soren's eyes, it was just Vivian saving a slave, but in Vivian's eyes she just helped a very pitiful person. Both of them didn't notice the changes in the slaves, especially the 2 slaves who were helped by Vivian. Their hearts were filled with gratitude for escaping death. The change wasn't obvious, but it was like a seed that had begun to sprout. Soren sat on the deck and whispered to Vivian. It was all simple things. Occasionally the little girl would ask him a few tips on learning spells. Although Vivian's talent in spells was stronger than Soren's, her experience in fighting spellcasters was definitely not as good as Soren's. Fighting style was difficult to teach because wizards basically didn't have any fighting style. Their only style was to learn as much as possible about the opponent before the battle, collect information about the opponent's abilities, and then fully prepare for the battle. There was a saying that went like this: "A prepared sorcerer is almost invincible." There were different ways to fight against different enemies. The real test of a spellcaster's ability was a sudden and unexpected battle. That was the critical moment when luck, experience, knowledge, and so on were tested. Soren's point of view on spells was similar to Gloria's. That was, a wizard must first master a large amount of knowledge, including humanities, geography, customs, elements, planes, domains, astrology, spirit, beliefs, and so on. This huge amount of knowledge could be the strongest backing, and when experience reached a certain level, it could be transformed into real power. At that time, a wizard's fighting ability would be formed. A fixed set of spell memories was not easy to use. For example, in the current C environment, more than 70% of the spell memories had hidden dangers, and it was necessary to test one's ability to adapt. What Soren taught Vivian now was the knowledge of adapting to changing situations. It wasn't about which spells were better or which ones were more effective. Instead, it was about deciding the way to fight based on the environment. This was the core fighting philosophy of rogues, and also Soren's survival technique. Rogues couldn't beat warriors in a one-on-one fight, and they couldn't beat rangers in a long-range fight with bows and arrows. The most obvious characteristic of a good rogue was that they could adapt to any combat environment and always find the most advantageous way to fight. The so-called prepared adepts were also looking for the most advantageous way to fight. Vivian sat on Soren's lap and listened quietly. From time to time, she would tilt her head and frown as she pondered. There were some things that she didn't quite understand. After all, she was still too young, but that didn't stop her from memorizing them. Vivian's memory wasn't any worse than Soren's. She also had a photographic memory, and her ability to understand knowledge was much better than Soren's. Currently, she was limited by her age. Her mentality and thoughts were not fully mature yet, so she would occasionally have very childish thoughts. This was normal. If someone had a good memory and could recall things when they were 10 years old, they would definitely be sure that they were a naughty child at that time. Many of her thoughts were very childish, and her way of thinking was also limited. Soon it was noon. Adele Isabella came up with a bowl of base soup. The red-haired female pirate was a little strange recently. She actually thought of cooking for Soren. The group quickly finished a simple lunch. There weren't so many requirements for sailing at sea. The most important thing was to have a balanced nutrition and enough fresh water. Vegetables were the most important for long-distance sailing, and meat could be supplemented by fish. Vivian had been more sleepy recently. For some reason, she could currently sleep about 16 hours a day, which was several hours more than a normal child of her age. From the outside, the little girl seemed to be a little exhausted and a little dispirited. But Soren didn't know why she was exhausted. She didn't move much recently. The little girl quickly went to take a nap after filling her stomach. Before she left, she muttered something to herself. Unfortunately, Soren didn't hear anything. He couldn't read lips, so he didn't know what Vivian was muttering to herself. Therefore, there was never too much knowledge and skills. Soren didn't understand, so he just thought that the little girl was bored and mumbling. When children played games by themselves, it was easy for them to mumble something. After dealing with a lot of things, Soren finally had time to start upgrading his profession level. He had accumulated a lot of slaughter EXP, and he endured until now to upgrade his combat ability in one breath. Dual wielding, personal ability. In battle, you gradually learned how to use both hands to fight with two weapons at the same time. This is a very difficult combat skill to master. Only those who are very flexible with both hands can train it. However, after mastering this ability, you will attack faster than others in battle, although this will reduce your ability to hit the enemy. Number of attacks per round +1, accuracy -2. Prerequisite for enhanced dual wielding, it didn't seem to be a very powerful combat ability. Yes, dual wielding wasn't very powerful. It could deal with weaker enemies, but if you were dealing with enemies of similar strength, using two weapons at the same time would greatly reduce your chances of attacking the enemy. What Soren valued was not dual wielding, but enhanced dual wielding, greater dual wielding, and legendary dual wielding. A row of data appeared in front of him. The Shadow Dancer profession has been upgraded to level 3. Received 27 DX 22 plus INT 20 to 10, *0. 5. Skill points, HP increased by 14, profession HP 8 plus, con 21 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. You've received the Shadow Dancer Profession ability, Summon Shadow. You've received 1 free attribute point. You've received 1 ability point. With abundant slaughter EXP, Soren naturally prioritized upgrading the Shadow Dancer's level. The Shadow Dancer's level was calculated in the Rogue Profession level, but the highest level the Shadow Dancer could reach was Profession level 10. At that time, the Shadow Dancer profession would be maxed out. Many advanced professions had a profession level cap. For example, the Wizard's advanced profession, Archmage, could only be upgraded to level 5 at most. Summon Shadow, supernatural ability. Starting from Shadow Dancer profession level 3, the Shadow Dancer can summon a shadow to fight together. It is an undead shadow. Unlike ordinary shadows, this shadow cannot be dispelled, reprimanded, or commanded by others. This shadow is the Shadow Dancer's partner and can communicate with the Shadow Dancer clearly. Every time the Shadow Dancer levels up, the Shadow partner will get plus 2 basic HP. Up to 10 HP equivalent to an ordinary warrior. Advanced professions had a strong reproductive ability. Although the Shadow Dancer consumed a lot of slaughter EXP to upgrade his profession level, he could learn a lot of supernatural abilities as his profession level increased. This, Summon Shadow, was one of them. As the total profession level of the rogue increased to level 10, the slaughter EXP needed to level up suddenly skyrocketed to more than 75,000 points. The slaughter EXP would get higher and higher, and it would skyrocket again when the rogue's total level reached level 15. The most difficult thing to enter the realm of legends was after profession level 15. Many people were stuck there and could not cross over for a lifetime. It required more than 2 million slaughter EXP to upgrade to the realm of legends, nearly half of which was between profession level 15 and profession level 20. 1 free attribute. Soren still allocated it to dexterity and increased it to 23 points. As for the skill points, there was no doubt that they were added to knowledge. He had almost reached the requirements of Sage. To be able to master abilities so quickly and continuously receive various information prompts, Soren felt that it had something to do with the improvement of his knowledge. Finally, this was the advanced ability that Soren was most concerned about: Enhanced Dual Wielding. Enhanced Dual Wielding, personal ability. As the number of battles increases, you feel more comfortable with how to use weapons with both hands. You begin to feel the slight difference in the trajectory of the weapon's movement. When you launch an attack, you can continuously hit the enemy, leaving them with no chance to fight back. This kind of technique is still improving. You feel that you still have a lot of room for improvement, but this requires more from you. Number of attacks per round plus 2, accuracy minus 1, dexterity 16 points. Enhanced Dual Wielding. Soren unhesitatingly put his skill points into Enhanced Dual Wielding. This ability required dexterity, and the more advanced it was, the more dexterity it required to master. This was only the prerequisite for dual wielding, and the increase in combat strength was not obvious. When he mastered greater dual wielding, that would be the time when he would truly explode. At that time, Soren would not have an accuracy penalty, and at the same time the attack speed of his left hand would increase by 3, and the gap between the two hands would be further reduced. As for the final, legendary dual wielding, it was also called perfect dual wielding. In simple terms, Soren's main hand could attack for a number of times, and his secondary hand could attack for the same number of times. Both his hands would become equally agile, and his attack speed and accuracy would be the same in battle. With legendary dual wielding, there would be absolutely no pressure for him to slash more than 10 times in a second. Using a sword to block bullets would be like child's play. That would be the time when he would truly be awesome. However, the final, legendary dual wielding, was very difficult to master. Any ability that started from legendary was extremely difficult to master. Chapter 245. After leveling up his Shadow Dancer profession, Soren still had more than 60,000 slaughter EXP left. In one breath, he put all the slaughter EXP into the wizard profession level, preparing to get one more attribute point. This was the last attribute point he could get in advance. Starting from wizard profession level 9, the slaughter EXP needed to increase their strength began to multiply. After wizard profession level 15, the slaughter EXP needed to level up was completely higher than any other profession. In the future, unless Soren could successfully kill a god, the speed of accumulating slaughter EXP would be far from enough. The wizard profession has leveled up to level 8. Received 25 INT 20 plus INT 20 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Received 1 free attribute point. The wizard profession has leveled up to level 9. Received 25 INT 20 plus INT 20 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, asterisk 0. 5. Received 1 ability point. 1 attribute point at each level and 1 ability point at each level. Without a doubt, Soren put the free attribute point into dexterity, pushing his dexterity to 24 points, and then put the ability he got into enhanced dual wielding. Although Soren wanted to use this ability point to master the wizard's meta magic ability, he thought about it and decided to put it into combat ability. The wizard's combat power was very strong, but it was a profession that consumed a lot of time, money, and energy. Soren didn't have enough time to learn spells, conduct research, and hone his casting skills. So, his first combat priority was still in the rogue field, which he was most familiar with. The wizard's spells were only auxiliary to his combat ability. Greater dual wielding, personal ability. With more and more combat experience, you have become more and more proficient in dual wielding. You are already a master of dual wielding. Even in the Underdark, there are not many people who are more powerful than you. Among 1,000 people who use dual weapons in battle, you can be ranked first. You have already grasped and comprehended the advanced technique of using dual weapons in battle. This allows you to use dual weapons in battle without any mistakes or penalties. Number of attacks per round plus 3, no hit penalty, 18 dexterity. I finally got advanced dual wielding. Soren looked around and walked to the edge of the ship. He held the 2 scimitars in his hands and lifted up a wooden plank. Clang. Rays of cold light flashed. Soren unsheathed his scimitars at the same time, and the wooden board was shrouded in the glint of his scimitars. By the time Soren finished a round of attacks and sheathed his scimitars, the wooden board had already turned into 12 pieces of wood that fell to the ground. He had slashed out a total of 8 times. His right hand had slashed out 5 times, and his left hand had slashed out 3 times. Since Soren hadn't mastered the legendary dual-wielding ability, he couldn't perfectly replicate the speed of his 2 hands. That was the limit of what he could do. Soren's current talent accumulation was not enough. At his peak he could slash out 18 times in 1 round. Remark: 1 round refers to the speed of 1 second. In actual combat, one might not be able to maintain this speed. If you're interested, you can try it with a small knife. Ordinary people can also slash out 2 to 3 times in a second, but it's very difficult to go beyond that. After distributing the free attribute points and talent points, Soren focused his attention on the skill points. He had been holding back for so long, and finally he had reached the requirements to master the background ability, Sage. God had opened his eyes. After enduring for so long, he had finally made it. In order to achieve the conditions of mastering Erudite, he didn't even invest much skill points into his rogue class skills. He relied entirely on his own battle experience to improve bit by bit, and the speed of improvement was really quite slow. Soren's current rogue skills had not even reached 50 points. If it wasn't for the background ability Sage, he would have already increased all his skills to more than 100 points. With the allocation of skill points, Soren's knowledge finally reached 250 points. A row of data also appeared: special conditions triggered. Prerequisite ability, encyclopedic knowledge, achieved. The prerequisite of 250 literacy has been achieved. You have automatically received a new background ability, Sage. As soon as the data appeared, Soren couldn't wait to look at his new background ability. Sage, background ability. Your knowledge has become more and more amazing. You know almost every field. As you accumulate more knowledge, you will be able to comprehend most things by analogy, and your learning speed will be several times faster than others. This is not only limited to knowledge but also a variety of combat skills. You know how to calculate the weight axis of a weapon, how to calculate the time gap between casting spells, and use this to maximize its power. But you know more than this. The accumulation of knowledge has reached your current level, and it can be directly transformed into real power. Knowledge plus 10, prerequisite, have the ability, encyclopedic knowledge, 250 knowledge. Prerequisite for the special ability, master of knowledge. Prerequisite for the special ability, astral traveler. Prerequisite for the special ability, dimension explorer. This is? Because he didn't have a spellcaster profession in the past, Soren's knowledge wasn't very high, and he didn't have the talent ability, encyclopedic knowledge. So when he saw the row of prerequisites, Soren couldn't help but be surprised. Among them, Master of Knowledge, was needless to say. This was an advanced ability of Sage. But the last two hints seemed to be a bit amazing. Just by looking at the names, one could tell that it was very powerful. Especially, Astral Traveler. This was a famous background ability. Many legendary wizards even had the background ability, Astral Traveler, which was a legendary level background ability. As for the other, Dimension Explorer, Soren didn't know much about it. After allocating knowledge, Soren still had 12 skill points left, so he simply added them to Sneak. Anyway, a rogue's Sneak skill would never be too high. At this time, Soren's overall attributes were very different from the past. He had finally entered the level of powerful people. Name: Soren. Race: half-elf, son of Slaughter. Attributes: Strength 14 plus 2, Agility 24 plus 1, Constitution 21, Intelligence 20 plus 1, Wisdom 15, Charm 18 plus 2, Alignment: Lawful Evil Profession. Level 10 Commoner, Level 7 Rogue 063500, Level 3 Shadow Dancer, 075500, Level 9 Wizard, 068500, Grade 3 Health Points, 254254 Experience Points, 3075, Slaughter EXP, 545, Profession EXP, Unassigned Skill Points, none Attribute Points, none Legend Level, 21 Divinity Points, 9 Status, Normal Basic Skills. Sneak 185, Knowledge 250, Steal 45, Pick Lock 55, Snare 60, Focus 30, Negotiate 45, Appraise 30, Deceive 18, Threaten 42, Taunt 15, Perform 15, Listen 20, Dodge 85, Parry 25, Block 18, Heal 45, Search 20, Detect 25, Copy Scroll 25, Spell Identification 20, Survival 15, Use Magic Device 20, Cooking 30, Alchemy 15. Legendary Skills: Omnipotent Hands. Special Abilities: Blessing of the Misfortune Goddess, Blessing of the Sea Goddess, Killing Heart, Slayer, Ascetic, Scholar. Personal Abilities: Nimble Left Hand, Eidetic Memory, Perseverance, Encyclopedic Knowledge, Reflex Evasion, Nimble Movement, Evade Sight, Dark Vision, Spell Control, Empower Spell, Weak Cold Resistance, Greater Dual Wielding, Regeneration, Intermediate. Profession Abilities: Shadow Weave, Military Weapon, Proficiency, Curved Sword, Master. Combat Skills: Summon Shadow, Fearful Gaze, Divine, Fear, Divine, Shadow Strike, Shadow Jump, Counterspell, Sword Form, Heavy Hack, Sword Form, Behead. There were three main parts of combat power. The first was attribute points. One's attributes were the most direct combat power. People with high strength had high destructive power, people with high dexterity had high agility, people with high constitution had good endurance, and so on. The second was basic skills. This was a comprehensive ability in all kinds of situations, and it was also the area that determined one's most obvious weakness. Most of the time, basic skills couldn't be too low. If you didn't have enough parrying and blocking, you couldn't fight a tough battle. If your dodging ability was too poor, you would be finished if you encountered arrows. If you couldn't detect, listen, or survive in the wild, you would be a tragic figure. Even a kobold could successfully sneak up on you. As for your searching ability, if you were too poor, you wouldn't even be able to find the loot. Then there were other basic skills such as acting, deception, and intimidation, which were very useful. When you were adventuring, you would also need to know how to negotiate, appraise, and heal. Therefore, basic skills that didn't seem to be very eye-catching were often things that could determine your fate. Finally, there was the ability. This was very time-consuming and difficult to train, but it was also the most powerful part of combat power. Theoretically speaking, most of the people who could kill other high-grade professions basically had a clear advantage in their ability. These three parts of strength, when combined, would be your overall combat power. In the process of fighting against the enemy, as long as you could form an advantage in one of these aspects, your chances of winning would be increased by a lot. Soren liked to estimate his chances of winning every time he took action. Most of the time, his chances of winning were calculated according to these three conditions. If there was no obvious chance of winning, he would give up in the end. Time passed little by little. Sailing on the sea was actually a waste of time, and most of the time it was very boring. Soren used up most of his Slaughter EXP in one breath, and then began to train his combat ability. Earning slaughter EXP was only a part of improving one's strength. Sharpening one's combat skills and mastering one's ability was also quite important. Adele Isabella was still Soren's training partner, but this time, Soren increased the difficulty. He directly covered his eyes with a black cloth. That's blind battle ability was a very important special ability. It was very useful in many situations, so Soren had to master it in advance. Clang, clang, clang. The two quickly began to test each other's strength. Because Soren was blindfolded, most of the time he was on the defense. In the process of fighting against Adele Isabella, he was obviously at a disadvantage, but he didn't look like he was going to lose. On the contrary, as the number of battles increased, he gradually became invincible. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but after he mastered the Sage ability, his whole mind seemed to have become clearer. He could actually summarize Adele Isabella's attack style, habitual attack skills, subconscious attack direction, and so on in the process of battle. He could even summarize the memory of the wind detection skill, including what sound represented what action. This wasn't an improvement in intelligence. In Soren's view, it should be that his calculation and summarization ability had been further strengthened. It was as if the accumulation of knowledge had reached a critical point, and suddenly began to understand by analogy. In his mind, he could even speculate the direction of Adele's next attack. It felt a bit like danger sense. Clang, clang. A series of battle sounds rang out, and Soren gradually began to get used to it. Sometimes he could even counterattack the red-haired female pirate with the blind battle skills. In front of him, Adele obviously felt that the battle was getting more and more difficult. She gasped for breath, raised her hand to lift up her fiery red hair, and looked at Soren with eyes full of awe and disbelief. Her expression was as if she was looking at a monster. It wasn't that she had never seen a guy with amazing talent and a strong learning ability, but she had never heard of a person who could learn and grasp the ability to reach Soren's level. In the beginning, in order to master the blind battle skill, she spent nearly a year or two training. But how long did Soren take? Less than 3 days. According to this progress, in at most half a month, he would be able to master the blind battle skill. Received 3 information prompts. An afternoon of training quickly passed by. After today's training, Soren received a prompt for the second ordinary ability, Battle Experience. With each battle at sea, your combat ability in the sea environment has improved, and your ability to balance against the ship's bumps has increased. You have received some information about battle at sea. Perhaps it was because he hadn't accumulated enough. Soren only received a prompt for battle at sea, and the other abilities required further training. 2 days passed quickly. As the fleet gradually sailed towards the outer islands, they encountered more and more creatures along the way. They saw schools of swordfish, probably more than 100,000 of them. There was also a large group of flying scale fish that reflected the sparkling waves of the sea, as well as a large number of other fish. Because there were many dangerous sea creatures in the deep sea, fishermen rarely went into the sea to catch fish. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of fish moving around. Yesterday afternoon, Soren saw that the sea had turned red. He thought that he had encountered some kind of monster and was shocked for a moment. Then he found out that it was an uncountable number of lobsters. These lobsters were about the size of 3 fingers, which was a relatively common size in the current sea area. It was hard to tell how many lobsters there were, but there were sailors who threw a net into the sea and caught hundreds of red-shelled lobsters. The taste didn't seem to be anything special, and it wasn't much different from the lobsters he ate in his previous life. However, their pincers were more powerful, and their strength was greater than the lobsters in his previous life. If they encountered a larger lobster, they could directly snap a person's finger. An unlucky sailor almost had his finger snapped by a large lobster. In the evening, Soren sat on the deck and cut the lobsters with his dagger. Most of these lobsters were about the size of 2 fingers, and some of them were especially large, reaching the size of a person's palm. The pirates below caught more than 10 lobsters, and hurriedly sent someone to bring them to Soren to please him. Then Soren turned around and made roasted lobsters. At this moment he was feeding Vivian, whose mouth was full of oil. The little girl was eating very happily today. Because this was made by her brother, and because her brother's cooking was really delicious. Soren was rich. Naturally, he could use those expensive seasonings. When cooking, there were only 3 key points: ingredients, seasonings, and cooking skills. Soren now had good ingredients, expensive seasonings, and good cooking skills. Naturally, the food he made wouldn't taste bad. The little girl ate 2 lobsters in a row, and then she rubbed her round little belly with satisfaction. But at this time, the lookout on the ship next to them let out a suppressed cry of alarm and shouted, "Sea monster! There's a sea monster!" A commotion broke out. Then a huge shadow appeared in the distance. The shadow was hiding under the sea and it looked like a giant squid. It seemed to be more than 50 meters long. It really was a sea monster. Cries of alarm came from all directions, and then many people nervously looked at Soren's position. "Calm down." Soren stood at the bow of the ship and said in a deep voice, "Let's go over like this, don't make any moves." The distance between them was getting closer and closer. The sea monster was really a giant squid. It was about 60 meters long and its huge body was a little scary. It obviously noticed the fleet in front of it and it even circled around Soren. Then, as if it felt something, it avoided the fleet in front of it and swam past them about 100 meters away. There was no accident, so there was no battle. The two sides just brushed past each other. Soren watched the sea monster leave, but he thought to himself, "It seems that the blessing of the sea goddess is very effective." This was the first sea monster they encountered. In the next 2 days they encountered another 2 sea monsters, but they didn't attack them. On the 5th day of the voyage they were finally close to their destination, and Soren began to see scattered islands. They were almost at the outer islands. The 5th day of quitting smoking. Maybe it's because I'm always feeling uncomfortable, but it should be over in 2 days. I forgot who said it would be a lot better after 7 days. A 5,000-word chapter. Chapter 246. The Outer Islands. The geographical environment of this area was a bit special because it originally belonged to a continent. Later on, a large area of the continental plate collapsed and sank, causing the geography of the area to become like this. From the map, it was a bit like the place near Singapore after the Spratly Islands, but there were more scattered islands than the continental plate. The largest one was the territory of the Amazons, followed by the base camp of the indigenous people, and many large and small islands scattered in the sea. As he entered the area of the outer islands, Soren's face became dignified. The environment of this area was a bit like a tropical rainforest area, full of unknown dangers. Although the islands didn't attract much attention, the challenge difficulty of these islands were all level 9 and above. In other words, even a group of adventurers around grade 3 could be wiped out on some of these islands. There were a lot of unknown and terrifying creatures here, some of them were even small, but they were more dangerous than the dragon subspecies. Moreover, there were also prehistoric pythons that were quite difficult to deal with, some of them had a challenge rating of 15 and above. Basically, they were almost the same as dragons. Soren didn't have the slightest intention to explore these islands. Some of these places even the indigenous people wouldn't easily go near, so he naturally didn't want to explore these dangerous places. His destination was a large island in front of him. If he remembered correctly, there was an island with a diameter of more than 500 square kilometers in front of him, and there were other islands next to it. This was Soren's first stop. If it was suitable, he would set up a camp here. This was because the places he chose had natural harbors. Another 2 days passed. When Soren saw a towering mountain in front of him and a cliff standing on the coastline, he finally knew that he had arrived at his destination. There were many seagulls in front of him, and he could see a dense forest in the distance. There was a thick layer of bird droppings on the ground. The nearby islands were the resting places of migratory birds, so there was a huge amount of bird droppings accumulated here for thousands of years. Don't underestimate these bird droppings, they were a very precious resource. Because in simpler terms, these bird droppings accumulated over time and covered the ground, and they could be refined into the best fertilizer. Soren chose this place as a base not only because of the geographical advantage. Stop here. Soren looked at the others, then shifted his gaze to a spot on the cliff. There was a metal cross there and there seemed to be white bones on it. This white bones was once a very famous pirate king. Later he fell into the hands of the enemy and was directly nailed to death by cruel torture. His ghost appeared there, but it could only be encountered at a specific time. He would make a very difficult request to the others, and if it was completed, he would be able to obtain his treasure. The pirate king's soul seemed to have special requirements to meet his soul in the spiritual realm. Soren wasn't interested in accepting such a quest, even though the difficulty of this quest was almost legendary tier. He looked at the others and said, "You guys stay here. Adele Isabella. Humpback whale, Hulk. The few of you follow me to the island to take a look." A small fast boat was released. Soren quickly brought a few people to the island. Perhaps it was because there were very few outsiders here. When they just set foot on the island, birds actually flew all over the sky. There seemed to be some noise in the distance, but it soon calmed down. The town could be built in this area, but it was only relatively safe. Soren naturally wouldn't be naive enough to think that there were no enemies here. He didn't go too deep into the jungle but came to a flat land south of the cliff. This was a natural flat land, and it was also the place where others found it and built a town. There were some white stones in the woods and they were very brittle to the touch. They broke when you pinched them. Soren picked up a piece and smelled it, and then there was a smile on his face. The others also picked it up curiously and smelled it, but immediately threw it away with a face full of disgust because it smelled like feces and urine. These pirates couldn't see the value of these stones, but for Soren, they were the most important wealth, even more valuable than a gold mine. This place was actually an inexhaustible gold mine. It was just that the Aborigines did not know how to make use of it. Guano stone, a kind of ore also known as bird and beast feces. The accumulated feces and corpses of birds, bats and seals are a kind of high-quality fertilizer. Soren's mind was filled with the knowledge that he had learned before. The location of this island near the forest was the accumulation point of guano stones. Because it was in an area where migratory birds migrated, it was unknown how many guano stones had accumulated over thousands of years. 3 feet deep into the ground was the raw material of high-quality fertilizer. However, these were not the only valuable things here. Soren carefully looked around, then put his hands on the hilt of his sword, and gestured to the few people behind him and said in a deep voice, "Pay attention. There may be monsters around here." He gradually moved forward along the flat land, and as his eyes got higher and higher, the terrain began to become a high slope. Then there was a red land in front of him. There were some active beasts nearby, but when they saw Soren they immediately fled. These beasts felt the dangerous aura from them, and even a cheetah was scared and ran into the forest. Soren used his curved sword to cut the soil, then reached out and pinched the red soil in his hand, and then threw it on the ground with a smile on his face. It was indeed clay. In his memory, the town that was built here was built with red bricks. He didn't know what kind of craftsmanship was used, but in just 3 months, a brick house was built and a large wall was cut out. Bricks had begun to appear in ancient Rome, and when humans fired pottery, they had tried to fire other things with clay. Soren knew a little about the craft of making porcelain, so the requirements of firing red bricks were too simple for him. However, the most important point was how to increase the production. The construction technology in this world was quite advanced, but mass production was not widespread. Most of the high-end products were made by spellcasters. Soren still didn't know how that group of people burned so many bricks in a short time. But it didn't matter. That group of people began to develop overseas after the Avatar crisis, and he was now 2 years ahead of them. Even if he lacked a little technical advantage, he could still develop on a larger scale first. "What are you doing, sir?" A guy with a big head, who looked like a big-headed doll but had a ferocious face, stood at the back and whispered, "He's looking at the rocks and the soil. Are you looking to see if this place is suitable for farming? The land overseas is wasteland, and even if you want to reclaim it, it will take several years to become mature. Don't look at me like that. Before I became a pirate, I also plowed the land for several years." The appearance of a pirate was strange, and it basically had nothing to do with their appearance. He noticed that the others were looking at him strangely and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't look at me when I cut off heads. In fact, I'm also quite good at farming." Soren didn't pay attention to the back. He walked all the way to the top of the high slope, then looked down at the flat land in the distance, and then calculated the size and distance of the space in his mind. Maybe it was because of his powerful calculation ability, or maybe it was because of the data simulation. He actually built a rough town model in his mind. This place could accommodate the development space of a medium-sized city. Don't underestimate the guilds that developed overseas in his previous life. Many of them were professional talents, and the place they chose naturally had many comprehensive advantages. On the other side, the half-elf first mate stood on the bow of the ship. Suddenly he seemed to feel something. He couldn't help but look down at the bottom of the sea. The person next to him asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" He stared at the bottom of the sea for a while, then shook his head gently and said, "Nothing. I just saw something just now." Time ticked by. About 2 hours later, Soren finally finished inspecting the nearby area, and then came back with the others. He had made a decision in his heart. Although he still had 2 spare places that he hadn't seen, Soren was already very satisfied with this place. The location of the other 2 places was a bit remote, and it was still a day or 2 away from here. If he wanted to develop overseas, he must rely on the resources of the mainland. Therefore, the closer the route, the better. It would also be easier to transport other materials. This location, whether it was a natural port, geographical advantages, land resources, etc., could be regarded as a first-class place in the outer islands. And there was another advantage here, that was, the location was relatively far away from the Amazon's range of activity, and it was not near the indigenous people's base camp. Because the island was not very large, there were not many indigenous people who migrated here. In the outer islands, generally, the larger the island, the fiercer the competition was because it was a large territory. On the contrary, small islands had insufficient space for development, and sometimes there were no indigenous people living there. The island in front of him was neither big nor small. It was just right. There was room for development, and it was not too eye-catching. Disembark. Soren's face finally showed a smile, and he said in a deep voice, "Ship all the materials down and arrange for people to camp on the flat land in front." He was ready to enclose the land here. It's not easy to quit smoking. On the 6th day, my mental state has been very difficult recently, and this plot is being written slowly, so there may be fewer updates. Developing overseas is not a casual encirclement. It's a suicidal act. There are actually a lot of foreshadowing in this plot, and many things must be explained clearly. Finally, in 2 days I will announce a big event full of positive energy to you. Wait until I get through this period, then I will explode. Chapter 247. Speaking of Futu's success in quitting smoking, is this considered as spreading positive energy? The 8th day, it's really not easy. Today there are 2 more. The recent plot will be more high energy. Teams of people began to get busy. Soren stood on the deck of the Dragonhead warship and looked at the others. The Chamber of Commerce's management drove out the slaves and then let them carry things off the ship. The slave trade was not that simple. It was not that you could sell people as slaves as long as you caught them. The capture of slaves was limited to the indigenous people. If you dared to capture slaves on the mainland, it could be said that there would be people who would cut you with a knife. Even the relatively evil lords and aristocrats would never allow slave traders to act recklessly. They would be hanged at the intersection. Among Soren's slaves, about half of them were indigenous people, followed by about half of the mainland population. Slaves would appear because of many things such as war, crime, bankruptcy, and so on. Selling oneself as a slave was also very common in this world. After bankruptcy, it was not surprising that they would become debt goods. Among them, the slaves of the mainland population were a little better. The indigenous slaves were much more troublesome. They had to be captured and then tamed. The price of a docile slave could be increased by more than 50%, while a disobedient slave was only suitable to be thrown into the arena. There were many ways to tame slaves, some even involved taboo areas. Most of the slaves on the market were tamed slaves. The price of mainland slaves was higher, and the price of indigenous slaves was relatively cheaper. Soren did not have enough financial resources to use all the slaves from the mainland, so the proportion of indigenous slaves was still very high. With Soren's current experience, he could naturally see that many indigenous slaves' eyes lit up after getting off the ship because this was the outer islands they were familiar with. This made Soren feel a little headache, but there was no way. After all, this was where they lived. Returning to the place they were familiar with, these indigenous slaves' minds would easily have other thoughts. Watch them. Soren turned and glanced at Adele Isabella next to him. The red-haired female pirate seemed to be thinking about something. She stood on the deck in a daze for a while, then she came back to her senses. Soren said to her, "Pay attention to these indigenous slaves, you must not let them have a chance to escape." Adele Isabella quickly nodded and said in a deep voice, "Yes, Your Excellency." At the other side, there were already pirate leaders preparing to set up camp. These pirates were not a group of incompetent people who only knew how to fight. It was actually much harder to make a living on the sea than on land. Although many pirates were illiterate, they still had some knowledge. For example, the guy who was missing 2 fingers and had a scar on his forehead. This guy couldn't even write his own name, but he actually knew astrology and could sail in the sea without getting lost. Even if he didn't have any celestial bodies, he could still make a rough judgment based on the ocean currents, temperature, wind direction, and so on. This guy was a very capable person. Even though he wasn't that strong, he was still promoted to be the new pirate leader by Soren. Pirates respected capable people. The most important ability was combat power, but they also respected other abilities. Otherwise, a navigator's status would not be higher than that of many pirates. A large group of subordinates were preparing to set up camp. Soren had already brought a lot of supplies, enough for them to use for more than 3 months. There were also various tools. For this, he had mobilized a lot of resources from the Chamber of Commerce in Port Tylon. The others could more or less guess Soren's idea, but they were not so optimistic. The main reason was that there were too many dangers in the outer islands, and the land was not so suitable for farming. There were also all kinds of strange creatures and very xenophobic indigenous people. If there were indigenous people nearby and knew that they were camping here, the possibility of them attacking was quite high. Time passed little by little. Soren watched with satisfaction as the camp was set up. The pirates were cutting down trees and a simple camp was now 1/3 complete. In front, the half-elf first mate was instructing others to set up the tents. On the other side, the one-eyed man and the bald man were shouting at the slaves to carry the supplies. It looked like it would rain today, so it was best to move all the things into the tents. The weather change was also a very troublesome thing. It was impossible for the sun to always shine. Storms were more common here, and many supplies would be ruined once they got wet. The tools had been moved out, and the others were ready to erect a simple fence with wood according to Soren's instructions. Originally, Soren thought that his first day in the outer islands would pass peacefully. But he was wrong. Ah! A shrill scream suddenly came from a distance, and then Soren's figure turned into a shadow and rushed over. With Soren's action, the other pirate leaders hurriedly pulled out their weapons and rushed over. At the same time, they also ordered their men to prepare for battle. After all, this was the outer islands, the territory of the indigenous people. It was normal to have a battle. However, as Soren rushed over, he immediately found that it was not an attack by the indigenous people, but another kind of trouble that was also very troublesome. Your Excellency. The pirates standing in front of Soren's teeth were chattering. He was holding a leg in his hand, but only half of it was bloody. He stammered, "Frog." Frog was eaten. Only this much is left. Frog? It seemed to be the nickname of a pirate. There were often some messy nicknames among pirates. Soren frowned and glanced at the leg in his hand that originally belonged to a pirate nicknamed Frog. He noticed some irregular teeth marks on it and said with a serious expression, "What happened? What did you just see?" I saw it. I saw it." This guy was probably frightened and he spoke a little incoherently. After a while, he gradually calmed down and said, "I went to cut trees with Frog and looked for dry firewood on the way, but we didn't expect. Just when we were passing by, a strange plant suddenly opened a bloody mouth. Then Frog was swallowed. I wanted to pull him out. But that's all I could pull out." The pirate in front of him, who was frightened to the point of confusion, raised the bloody half of the thigh in his hand. Then he abruptly woke up and threw it away as if his mind was still a little confused. At this time the other pirates also rushed over. Soren turned to look at them and said, "It's not the indigenous people. Let the others go back and be on guard. Adele, you come with me to take a look." It would be easier if it wasn't the indigenous people. Because at this time, encountering the indigenous people was very likely to lead to a big battle. Soren didn't want to lose his men in a battle now. "Your Excellency?" Adele looked at the half of the leg on the ground with an ugly expression and wondered, what kind of monster did this? It can swallow a person in one bite and only half a leg is left. It doesn't seem to be an easy monster to deal with. Soren looked at her and said slowly, "I don't know. But I can roughly guess what it is. It seems that we are in trouble. There is a mutated area near this island. The plants inside have mutated. The jungle in front of them had traces of logging. In order to build a camp, they naturally needed to cut wood. Although Soren had the idea of burning bricks, the current resources and manpower were not enough. Cutting wood was the fastest way to build a camp. Adele Isabella followed behind. She looked at Soren and whispered, "Your Excellency, I suggest that we set fire to the mountain once. Otherwise there will be too many poisonous insects and snakes here. Today 2 or 3 people have been bitten by poisonous insects and snakes. Although it was not fatal, there was still a guy whose wound worsened. If this goes on, we will consume a lot of manpower to deal with poisonous insects." Yes, poisonous insects and snakes were a very troublesome problem. Those who had never been to such a primitive area would not be able to imagine how many poisonous insects there were. If someone had smoked a house that had not been lived in for a long time, or some holes in the wild, they would find all kinds of insects crawling out of them. Just looking at them would make one's scalp tingle. It was not so easy to open up the wilderness, let alone open up the more dangerous outer islands. They were getting closer and closer to the site of the incident. Soren suddenly reached out and stopped the red-haired female pirate next to him, and then said in a deep voice, "Be careful. There's something wrong with this jungle." It was too quiet. The jungle in front of them was too quiet. It was so quiet that even the sound of insects could not be heard. Adele Isabella stretched out her hands and held the two swords. Then she bent slightly and looked around. She also found that the environment in front of her was very wrong. It seemed that the nearby plants and trees looked a little strange. Their colors were too bright and they grew too well. The other trees nearby have withered leaves and branches, but the forest in front of us is lush and green. There were drops of blood in front of them. Soren reached out and picked up a little blood to take a look. Then he saw a strange plant that looked like a morning glory. The blood started from there and came all the way here. His face was not very good and he murmured, "Rip flower? Damn it. This is really a mutated area. Rip flower, mutated plant, piranha flower, grade 4. Challenge rating. Level 8, monster level 16 has spell-like abilities. Highest and lowest attributes, 22 and 10. Total attribute points, 90 to 100. Special abilities, devouring attack, vine tentacles, mutated plant, piranha flower. Difficulty, C+. Chapter 248. Rip flower. One of the variants of the man-eating flower, a dangerous creature that looked like a giant trumpet flower. There were many strange plants in the jungle, including the man-eating plants. Most of them were man-eating flowers and man-eating trees. Ordinary man-eating plants were easier to deal with, but the most difficult ones were the mutants. Because of a catastrophe in the outer islands, there was an invisible energy field underground, so the creatures here were prone to mutation. Although humans did not have many mutations, they also had some strange innate abilities, mastering spell-like skills similar to psionic. However, it was not real psionic, but a manifestation of a single psionic spell. This kind of energy field would not only affect the indigenous people, but also these mutated plants. Therefore, some abnormal creatures would also have spell-like abilities. For example, the rip flower in front of them. It may have some special spell-like abilities, but it was hard to say what they were because many mutant creatures were different. Your Excellency? Adele Isabella frowned and looked ahead, whispering, "How do we deal with it?" She didn't know if it was a woman's intuition, but she thought that the strange plant in front of her was not so easy to deal with, because this strange plant gave her a very dangerous aura, which made her say, "Your Excellency, how about we use kerosene to deal with it? I remember there are several barrels of kerosene on the ship, which should be able to burn this creature." Soren turned to look at her, shook his head and said, "It's useless. Fire is too ineffective against this creature. It needs a lot of kerosene to burn it. More than half of its body roots are in the ground. Cover me." Soren bowed slightly and whispered, then flew towards the location of the rip flower. This kind of mutant creature's reaction was relatively slow, and it had relatively stronger vitality than many flesh and blood creatures. Soren had to familiarize himself with its combat power first, because there were probably more of these creatures. The challenge of the outer islands was no less difficult than that of the Underdark, and nearly 1/3 of it was because of such dangerous creatures. They were not weaker than the various monsters and creatures in the Underdark, and some were even more dangerous. Fire was not realistic. Unless they got something like asphalt gasoline, they could burn the rip flower in front of them. Otherwise, using other firewood was simply sending their men to their deaths. A creature level of 16 was no joke. Although the challenge level of the rip flower was not high, only half of the creature level, and the final challenge difficulty was only level C, its creature level was on the same level as the sky dragon. The reason why the difficulty was so low was because it was a plant-type enemy and had a relatively obvious weakness. However, plant-type enemies also had one thing in common, and that was that the underground part was the most crucial part. Just attacking the surface alone might not be enough to kill them. Bang! Soren stomped his feet on a nearby tree to gain momentum. Then he swung his machete at the rip flower in front of him. The surface of this man-eating flower was its feeding organ. Looking at the bulging inside, it was obvious that the dead pirate was inside. However, what Soren did not expect was that the rip flower did not react to his attack at all. When his machete hit the surface of the ground, it suddenly seemed to be startled, and 5 or 6 vines shot out from the ground in an instant. Soren's blade seemed to have hit a tough cowhide. It was clearly a plant, but after cutting the surface, a bright red liquid flowed out. It looked a bit like blood. Clang. Soren cut the vines with his machete and blood flowed out from it. These vines were unspeakably strange. After being cut off and falling to the ground, they were like the tentacles of a strange animal, which made people feel a little numb. At this moment, The surface feeding organ of the petal, which was as tough as cowhide, opened up. In the outer part of the petal, 3 rows of densely packed teeth could be seen. The teeth were a bit like the teeth of a great white shark. They were all fine and sharp teeth, and then they were distributed in 3 layers inside and outside. These teeth were still stained with blood and minced meat. Inside the petal, one could see the extension of the plant's rhizomes. It was like pulling open a plant's tube to provide nutrients. The petal in front of him also had something like blood vessels. The 3 rows of tiny teeth were actually wiggling on their own. Inside the huge flower bud was a pile of flesh that had been completely disfigured. Soren smelled something like a strong acid. However, it was not a strong acid, but the acid secreted by the ripe flower in front of him. This liquid could help it digest most of its prey, and then transfer part of the nutrients its body needed to the underground trunk. Although the ripe flower could rely on the soil to grow, its staple food was still the flesh and blood of various living creatures. Soren slashed out 3 times in a row. However, the effect was not very high. The part of the ripe flower that was directly above its body had a very strong defensive ability. When he slashed it, it was like slashing a dragon's skin. It did not cause much damage. A part of its trunk was attacked. Although the ripe flower had no eyes or facial features, it still felt Soren's position. Then the huge bud suddenly opened up like a bloody mouth and bit at Soren. Unfortunately, he was already prepared. How could he be bitten so easily? Instead, he took the opportunity to slash at the bottom of the root. The tough root was not cut off at once. Soren took the opportunity to slash several times in a row, and only then did he break the feeding organ above. Then, a very strange thing happened. There seemed to be a strange sound coming from the underground, and then he saw the flying vines retract a little. Then the ground under Soren's feet seemed to have a small pit. The feeding organ that was cut off on the ground looked like a huge morning glory, but the part with 3 layers of sharp teeth began to wither rapidly after being disconnected, as if it suddenly lost enough nutrients. Then the other part below seemed to have drilled deeper into the ground. Soren stabbed the ground with his sword, but he did not feel anything else. Let's go back first. Soren frowned as if he was thinking about something. He looked at his data prompt and did not receive any slaughter EXP. It seemed that the ripe flower was not dead yet. After he stepped back for a while, he said in a low voice, "Tell the others not to come here first. The plants here are very strange. There may be something terrible down there." Chapter 249. The most important part of a plant was definitely its roots. Many old trees could still sprout after their trunks were cut off, but if there was a problem with their roots, they would not live for long. The mutated plant creatures in the outer islands were all like this. Whether it was man-eating flowers, man-eating trees, or other unknown mutated plants, their core weakness was their roots. The things on the surface of the ground would not die even if they were cut off, and it would not take long for them to grow back. When a plant mutated to this extent, it was almost the same as an animal. Although they did not have as much intelligence as animals, they still relied on their instincts to do things. This area should be one of the places left behind by the disaster, but he did not know what was inside. With Soren's current strength, it was not a big problem for him to deal with these things, but this place was too strange and he did not dare to take the risk to go deep into it. It was better to leave this place for later, as he had a lot of things to do now. However, just as Soren was about to seal off this place to temporarily prevent others from approaching, Adele Isabella seemed to have seen something. She raised her finger and pointed in that direction and said, "Your Excellency, look. There seems to be something there." "What is it?" Soren stopped when he heard this, then looked to the side and saw a grayish-black thing. He carefully walked over, paying attention to the strange trees nearby, then reached out and grabbed a corner to pick it up. However, he could not pull it out when he tried hard. It seemed that there was still a part of it buried under the ground. In desperation, he could only make a gesture to the red-haired female pirate behind him, and then the two of them used their weapons to dig out the grayish-black stone at the same time. "It's obsidian." Soren's face showed an expression of disbelief, then he looked at the grayish-black stone in his hand. Because of the long-term weathering and the passage of time, this obsidian no longer looked like it used to, but he could vaguely tell that it was part of a building sculpture, and it should have existed for a long time. Obsidian was a very strong and durable ore, and it had been weathered for at least thousands of years. It was a very rare ore. It could be used in many places, but it was most commonly used on a large scale, so it was used on sculptures. In Soren's memory, there were only 2 places where it could be used. The first was the golem puppet. The second was the Magus Tower. Whether it was the golems or the Adept's Tower, this area was definitely the territory of a powerful adept a long time ago. Since there were artificially polished obsidian fragments here, it was highly likely that there was something related to the adepts inside. There might even be an Adept's Tower. Thinking of this, Soren's breathing quickened. Even if it was a broken Magus tower that had been around for thousands of years, it was still very tempting to him. Even if all the functions inside were destroyed, many of the things stored inside still had astonishing value. If Soren's guess was correct, this place might be an ancient ruin left behind by the Arcane Empire. There might be information spells from the Arcane Empire that had survived, and its value was hard to estimate. Let's go in and take a look. Soren, who was planning to leave, decided to go in and explore. He told the red-haired female pirate behind him, "Pay attention to the surroundings. Let's try not to disturb these plants. They look like they're asleep." At this time the sky was a little dark. Soren looked up at the sky, then made a gesture to Adele Isabella beside him. The two separated and went around from the side. There were many strange trees and flowers around. They looked very large, a bit like an ancient forest. Occasionally they would touch some leaves and the whole plant would move a little. However, they didn't seem to attack. These strange plants seemed to only attack creatures when they were attacked or needed to eat. This was very similar to how beasts would not be aggressive when they were full. The vision in front gradually widened. Soren saw a large lavender flower. He frowned and looked at it, murmuring, "Mandala? No, it just looks a bit like it." He looked back at the red-haired female pirate and said in a deep voice, "Be careful. Let's go around." This place did not look like it grew naturally. Instead, it looked like it was artificially cultivated in the past, and then for some reason, it had survived until now. There were strange flower seeds on the ground. They seemed to be left behind by this kind of plant, but most of them did not germinate because the ground could not support so many plants. Some of the flower seeds had been damaged and disappeared, but there were still some that remained. It was just that he did not know what they were used for. Soren felt that these plants were dangerous. It was purely the intuition of an experienced rogue, so he did not dare to disturb them. Many of the plants here seemed to be alive. After bypassing these strange flowers, the outline of some broken buildings appeared in front of them. Because the weathering was too strong, and there were all kinds of strange plants growing around. Even with Soren's experience, he could not tell what it was. He could not even find an entrance to the building in front of him. Naturally, he could not judge the situation from the outside. Not all underground ruins would leave an entrance for you, or even help you to open up a tunnel to explore. In more high-end or ancient places, many underground ruins would not even leave you an entrance. What should I do then? Dig. Dig by yourself. Dig a hole, dig a tunnel. High-level adventurers often dug this way. Many sunken cities in the desert would collapse and the quicksand would pour in. Many years ago, many people dug all the way to find treasures. When Soren saw the surface of the ruins that did not even leave a hole for him, he knew that today's exploration would have to stop here. This building had completely sunk into the ground, and it might even be filled with seawater. Anyway, many things could happen. There was no way to go in now. Soren had to open up a tunnel here, then arrange for people to dig, and finally find a tunnel that could be entered together. He observed for a while. He was ready to memorize the surrounding environment and some landmarks, but at this time, the red-haired female pirate suddenly said, "Your Excellency. Look at the corner of the wall, there seems to be something wrong." Her detection ability seemed to be very strong. Soren looked at the red-haired female pirate with some surprise, and then moved towards the wall. He did not know if this woman's intuition was high or her basic skills were strong, but her detection ability seemed to be a little stronger than his. In front of Soren was a plant that looked a bit like a lantern plant. He did not dare to get too close, so he went around to the back and then saw a strange gray crack. A spatial crack? Soren's expression was a little surprised and he murmured, "The shadow plane. The building here is connected to the shadow plane?" It seemed to be a permanently solidified dimensional rift. Did the owner of this place in the past open up a fixed portal? The shadow plane. The non-material plane that Soren was most familiar with. He just glanced at the spatial crack in front of him, and he roughly guessed its function and reason. He was sure that he was more than 90% correct. This was not arrogance but confidence. He had traveled to the shadow plane too many times, and he even lived in the shadow plane for a period of time. "Let's go." Soren looked up at the sky and said slowly, "We'll come back later. It's too dangerous to go in rashly now." The shadow plane was not to be trifled with. Because although the shadow plane was connected to the material plane, the environment of the two was not the same, and there may be some ancient and dangerous creatures. Moving in the Shadow Plane, you may encounter monsters with a challenge rating of grade 3 or above at any time, and the ratio of quasi-legendary creatures to legendary monsters was quite large, much larger than in the material plane. And there were shadow dragons in many places. The two of them carefully retreated. At this time the camp was almost completed. Although it was still very simple, after all, it had only been a day, so Soren did not ask for anything. Today's discovery in the strange jungle was the focus of Soren's consideration. The slaves were driven together by the pirates, and after working for half a day, they also received some food at this moment. Although it was very rough and poor quality, at least it could fill their stomachs. Soren was not a stingy person. If the slaves were not fed, they would not have the strength to work. It was a very simple principle. The night passed quickly. When Soren woke up and was about to think about how to explore the strange place, the half-elf first mate walked in quickly and said, "Your Excellency, last night, 3 slaves secretly escaped." "What?" Soren's face instantly turned pale. The half-elf first mate noticed his expression and quickly said, "But 2 of them were caught by us as soon as they ran out. The other one escaped into the jungle. I have already sent people to catch him. All of them were natives. Your Excellency, I suggest that these natives be handcuffed to work. They are much more disobedient than other slaves." Soren's face was very gloomy. After hearing the half-elf first mate's words, he gently shook his head and then said with a cold expression, "No need. Pass down my order to prepare 2 crosses and nail the 2 runaway slaves on them. The crosses will be erected at the place where the slaves are working." The half-elf first mate heard this and showed a cruel smile. He immediately nodded and said, "Okay, Your Excellency. I will do it immediately." They were pirates. Piracy was not a benevolent profession. These slaves must be taught respect. Chapter 250. A faint light appeared on the horizon. On the left side of the temporary camp, nearly 300 slaves were gathered together, trembling. In front of them was a group of pirates with fierce faces. Along with a scream not far away, 2 burly and powerful pirates walked over, one carrying 2 indigenous slaves with one hand and the other carrying them in one hand. Behind them were 4 ferocious-looking pirate minions. They each held a wooden stake and then set up a rough cross in front of the group of slaves. "This is the fate of those who run away." The half-elf first mate's face was not very good. He was just ready to show off in front of Soren, but he didn't expect that a slave would run away the next day. This was tantamount to a slap in the face, telling Soren that he was incompetent. So now he didn't have the slightest good impression of the slaves who ran away. He even wanted to skin them alive. The half-elf first mate looked at the slaves in front of him coldly. Looking at their frightened expressions, he said in a deep voice, "All those who dare to run away, they will end up like you." Patter. The half-elf first mate glanced to the side, and then 2 burly pirates came over with 2 indigenous slaves who were obviously beaten. Then a one-eyed man with a missing left eye stood up with a grin. He held a hammer and nail in his hand. Because of the manufacturing process, the nail in this era was not the kind that we were familiar with, but the kind of conical nail that was as thick as a finger. The one-eyed man winked at the person next to him, and then someone forcibly separated the 2 slaves and fixed their limbs on the rough cross. "No. No. Please." The 2 aborigines seemed to know their fate. They couldn't help but tremble. One of them seemed to be able to speak a little bit of the common language. He kept crying and begging. The slaves below didn't dare to look at him. But no matter how he begged, it was useless. The one-eyed man raised the hammer with a grin, and then pointed the nail at his palm. With a bang, the nail that was as thick as a finger went through the palm of the indigenous slave, and then it hit the wooden stake behind him. An incomparably shrill scream sounded. The sound was very horrifying. A stream of blood flowed out of the palm that was nailed, and then dripped along the finger to the ground. The 2 indigenous slaves who were executed were trembling all over, and the voice in their mouth had changed a little. They were still begging, expressing their regret and ignorance, but in the end there was no mercy for them. The one-eyed man continued to pick up the nail, and then nailed their other palm on the wooden stake. But this was just the beginning. This punishment used a total of 9 nails. At first it was the palm, then the elbow, then the foot, and then the knee. As for the last nail, this was used only at the end of the punishment. When the victim was about to bleed out or was close to death, the executioner would pick up a very long and narrow nail and drive it into the victim's forehead. Under normal circumstances, The last nail was not used because it was a kind of punishment with the nature of a taboo curse. Many places believed that if the nail was pierced into the forehead, the victim's soul would be nailed to the cross, and there was a chance that this person would become a terrifying vengeful spirit. After all, the undead were supernatural creatures. Even professionals didn't dare to say that they could win against the undead. After all, they could travel between the spiritual world and the material plane. Soren watched the whole process of the execution. He must sternly stop this kind of escape. Otherwise, these slaves would become more and more unmanageable in the future. He was a person who respected the rules, and he didn't have a sense of historical mission to remove the slavery system. Because even with the technological level of his previous life, the slavery system was only removed a long time later, and the prosperous manor economy at that time was completely supported by slave labor. In his previous life, the complete removal of the slavery system was delayed until the 20th century, which showed how amazing the remaining power of this system was. Its existence was reasonable. Although it might not be a good thing, the current slavery system couldn't be shaken because many gods and churches supported the slavery system. Blood dripped down. The two indigenous slaves who were nailed to the wooden stake had begun to breathe weakly. Their initial shrill screams had changed and now they were almost hoarse. But the whole process wasn't over yet. The blood would gradually coagulate because it wasn't a fatal wound. They still needed to be exposed to the sun for a while before they died. The punishment wouldn't end with their death. After they died, their bodies would still be nailed to the wooden frame, and then the smell of blood would attract a lot of scavengers such as crows. Finally, the crows would begin to peck at the bodies until only the bones were left. This punishment process may last for a week. It mainly depended on how many crows were attracted, and whether the master who ordered this punishment was in a good mood. Some of the slaves below were scared silly. The two aborigines were nailed to the cross, dripping with blood, and then erected in front of them. Following that, the pirates began to instruct them to work. Because of the living example in front of them, these slaves worked very hard. Only when they stopped occasionally and saw the two of their kind nailed to the wooden stakes, would their eyes reveal a trace of sadness. However, there were also some who rejoiced in other people's misfortune. After all, half of the slaves were indigenous people and the other half were mainland people. The indigenous people would want to escape because this was the outer islands where they lived. But the mainland slaves would never want to escape because they couldn't survive if they escaped. If it wasn't for the scarcity of slaves on the mainland, and because they were relatively docile and expensive, Soren really intended to buy more. Brother? Vivian's figure appeared not far away. The little girl was wearing a black princess dress. She raised her small hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes, then said, "What happened just now? I seem to hear someone screaming." The little girl slept for a long time yesterday. Recently, she seemed to be very sleepy, but she didn't know the reason. Even Soren wasn't sure. However, Vivian's state was normal, and her physical condition seemed to be very good. One more obvious thing was that her strength was much greater than before. At present, she had the strength of a 12 or 13-year-old child. Maybe the little girl was developing. Soren felt that she was about 1 or 2 centimeters taller than before. Now, she was probably a little taller than Aladdin. But speaking of which, Aladdin was really short. Vivian seemed to have just woken up. She rubbed the corner of her eyes in a daze, then blinked her big eyes and looked around. When she heard the subordinate beside her explain what just happened, she couldn't help but pout and nodded seriously. "It should be like this. This group of lowly slaves. As the private property of my brother, they actually dared to escape. They should be nailed to death. Let's see if they dare to escape in the future." At first, Soren was a little worried that the kind-hearted girl would reject this kind of punishment. But hearing the words from the little girl's mouth, Soren couldn't help but smile. This was his Vivian. The little girl who said, "If you kill someone, I'll help you set a fire." Kindness couldn't solve the problem. At least most of the time, kindness couldn't solve the problem. It would only make the problem worse. It wasn't time for Soren to show his kindness. Now, the outer islands could be said to be in danger at every step. There were all kinds of dangerous things and all kinds of hidden troubles. He would never allow his slaves to make trouble for him. Today, Vivian seemed to be particularly bold. She raised her hand and straightened her beautiful black princess dress, then tied her hair into a double ponytail with a hair band. The little girl had a single ponytail and a double ponytail every day. She seemed to be having a lot of fun. She tilted her head and looked at the two bloody indigenous slaves nailed to the wooden stake. Then she turned around and looked at the other busy slaves. Two of the slaves immediately knelt down when they saw her and kowtowed with an excited expression. It seemed that she had used magic to save the two guys. The little girl nodded reservedly. She looked down at them like a noble princess and said, "Work hard." I remember my brother said that as long as you work hard, some of you will be granted freedom. My brother always keeps his words. I believe you will soon be free. Chapter 251. The others obviously didn't believe the little girl's words. He had never heard of a slave owner who would generously grant freedom to the slaves in front of him, let alone give freedom to a portion of them. Most of the slaves showed a trace of doubt on their faces. Some of them even had a mocking expression, thinking that this was a trick to fool them into working hard. However, the two northern slaves who were saved by Vivian were pleasantly surprised. They seemed to believe the words of the little angel-like girl in front of them. It didn't matter whether the slaves believed it or not, because the supervisors were the fierce and cruel pirates. If the slaves didn't work hard, they believed that the pirates who were used to seeing blood and cruel means had ways to make them obedient. This was the advantage of being a pirate. With such a group of subordinates, they could do things without rules. Their cruelty and bloodthirstiness could help Soren solve a lot of problems. Some of the things that couldn't be seen in the light of day didn't even need to be done by him. The pirate leader below had already helped him solve it. Anyway, Soren wasn't a kind and noble person. So what if the means were cruel? Now only cruel means could make them obedient. The punishment over there was still continuing. The two natives who escaped were almost dead after being exposed to the sun for a whole morning. Soren thought about it and didn't let his subordinates hammer the nails into their foreheads. Instead, he let them die on the wooden stakes and then handed them to the scavenger birds that were attracted. Nailing the nails into the foreheads could really give birth to the undead. Although Soren wasn't afraid at all, he hated troublesome things. The two natives didn't last long. Their vitality wasn't strong enough. They died on the first day, but their bodies were still standing in the place where the slaves worked. At the latest, crows, vultures, and seabirds would appear tomorrow. At noon. The half-elf first mate's face didn't look very good. He came over and whispered, "Your Excellency, one of the slaves who escaped is missing. We couldn't track him down. Your subordinates are useless. 3 escaped and 2 were caught." After Soren heard the other party's words, he frowned slightly, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it." There was no need to care about him anymore. He ordered the others to prepare to lay the foundation. "Then you take some people to the City of Wealth. I need some dwarven craftsmen. It's best if they know how to bake bricks and build furnaces. Find a way to poach other people with construction skills. Don't worry about the price. Snake Island still has a sum of money. You can take it out and use it at any time." The half-elf first mate quickly nodded and said, "No problem. This kind of construction craftsman is easy to find. There are also some dwarves in the City of Wealth. I will definitely find a way to bring them over." Speaking of this, a cold light flashed in his eyes. He had already messed up once, so he couldn't mess it up again. This time, even if he had to kidnap them, he had to kidnap them. In any case, they were pirates. Pirates did not need to reason with people. If they recruited people through normal means, there might be all kinds of messy requests and matters. He just brought people with him and went over with knives. He wanted to see who would dare not come. Now, anyone with a discerning eye could see that His Excellency Throat Cutter was preparing to establish a foundation here. Whether or not he could perform well would determine his future status. "You may leave." Soren nodded gently and said, "You go and call Adele in and then call One-Eyed Dragon." The half-elf first mate responded and retreated. After a while, the figure of the red-haired female pirate appeared outside the tent. She came in and bowed slightly, then said, "What are your orders?" Soren looked up at her, then handed over a white stone and directly ordered, "This is a guano stone. It's a very valuable fertilizer. It can be used on crops after a little refining. It can greatly increase the yield of crops. You take people to send this stone to the Alchemy Guild of the Wizard Alliance. I believe they will be interested in this stone. Just send it over. If they are interested, let them send someone to talk to me." Guano stone? The red-haired female pirate's expression was a little puzzled. Although she had mastered a lot of knowledge, she didn't know much about farming. However, this didn't affect her understanding of the meaning of fertilizer. So she immediately nodded and said, "I'll go now. I promise to send it over." "Very good." Soren nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, "I've asked people to prepare 3 boxes of samples. You can send them directly by a fast ship, and then help me purchase the things on the order." Speaking of this, Soren took out a list and said, There is still a sum of money in Port Tylon. You can go and get it. The things I need must be delivered and the things I need must be brought back next month. Adele Isabella nodded with a serious expression and said, "Yes, sir. I promise to complete the task." Soren waved his hand gently. The red-haired female pirate couldn't help but look back at him before going out. Then she went out and met a ferocious-looking one-eyed dragon and a bald, hook-nosed pirate. The two men glanced at the red-haired female pirate slightly. Their expressions didn't seem to be too respectful. However, after walking into the tent they were a lot more honest. They quickly bowed their heads respectfully and said, "Your Excellency." The hook-nosed pirate was the first to speak. He bowed slightly and said, "3 of us were bitten today. There are too many poisonous insects and snakes here. The brothers below are a little frightened. Your Excellency, are we going to scatter the powder we brought over?" Soren stood up when he heard the words. He went outside the tent and looked up at the sky. The sun was better today. He thought for a moment and said, "Wait until noon to scatter it. Scatter it around the camp. First, let people pay attention to cleaning up the surroundings." The environment here was very bad. There were many poisonous insects and snakes overseas. If you were accidentally bitten, it would be troublesome. If you were lightly bitten, you would bleed and bleed. If you were seriously poisoned, you would die. Even the mosquitoes here could cause wound infection and worsen. When Soren came, he considered all aspects. He was a person who planned and acted. He did bring a lot of insect repellent powder, but it was not to deal with these poisonous insects, but to deal with more troublesome things. But now that there were almost a dozen non-combat casualties, it was better to scatter the powder quickly. Suddenly a scream came from outside. Then a small pirate leader ran in. He said a few words outside and someone came in to report, "Your Excellency." A slave dug up a hibernating snake and was bitten by it. Monkey drained his blood to expel the poison, but the snake seems to be very poisonous. The slave can't be saved. Damn it. What a stupid guy. A hibernating snake could bite him? The climate of the outer islands was tropical. The winter here was very short, and many poisonous snakes did not hibernate. The temperature here was much higher and there was basically no ice and snow. But in an area with such a climate, it was easy to breed mosquitoes and snakes. Sometimes, there was no way to deal with these environmental factors. They could only passively deal with it. This was something that people who had been to primitive forests or other wild areas would understand. Soren frowned and rubbed his forehead. Then he said in a deep voice, "Clean up this area first. Set it on fire. Get someone to prepare a fire and smoke it. Then scatter the powder. It should not rain today. As long as it didn't rain, it would be fine. If it did, all the powder would go to waste." Soren's men immediately went to carry out the order. Then they saw the slaves and pirates clearing the bushes near the camp. All the weeds and bushes were cut down and dug up. Then they set fire to the grass on all sides. A thick plume of smoke rose into the sky. Following the spread of the fire and the scattering of the powder, a dense swarm of insects could be seen burrowing out from the underbrush. The sheer number of insects was enough to make one's scalp tingle. Many ferocious and cruel pirates felt goosebumps all over their bodies. Damn it! A strong northern pirate cursed. He couldn't help but tremble and murmured, "There are so many insects down there. I even slept there last night." How many insects were there? It wasn't easy to count, but there should be thousands. As long as there was fire and powder scattered, there would be 1 or 2 insects crawling out. Soren frowned slightly as he looked at the smoke rising from the fire. He glanced at his men next to him, then ordered a group of people to guard the perimeter. If there were indigenous tribes nearby, they might be discovered by the smoke. It was best to set up a sentry. The indigenous people were very xenophobic. After they discovered Soren and the others, the possibility of them attacking was quite high. It took an afternoon. All the pirates and slaves cleared all the weeds and bushes near the camp together. With the camp as the center, Soren ordered all the weeds and bushes to be burned and dug up. The outside of the camp was all freshly turned over soil, scattered with powder. There was no hiding place in this area, and the field of vision was very wide. Basically, there was nothing to hide. At the same time, there were a lot of logs piled up in the corner of the camp. The first step of construction was obviously still the need for wood. Soren's plan was to first build a simple fence, then build a house with logs and then expand it further. As for food and other materials, he could ship them over. As one of the 3 pirate kings, Soren could mobilize a lot of resources. There was nothing to worry about in terms of wood. There was a virgin forest everywhere. Now it was his men who were chopping the wood, so the progress was still relatively slow. When Soren cut the wood himself and practiced his swordsmanship, that would be the time for the progress bar to skyrocket. He was a jack of all trades. The job of cutting wood could train a lot of combat skills, especially violent sword attacks. Chapter 252. The houses in this world were relatively simple and rough. If someone was familiar with European history or tried the game from other time periods, they would find that the houses they lived in were relatively simple and rough. Some of the wood used to build the houses was not even shaved clean. It was completely different from the Central Plains at the same time period. But this was also good. Building a house could be said to be very fast. As long as there were enough carpenters, they could quickly build a house. In the future, when Soren made red bricks, these temporary wooden houses could be retired. As for the other very important part, the cement that everyone was familiar with, it was actually not that important. As early as thousands of years ago on Earth, there was a building method of digging trenches, filling burning soil, and using wood to support mud walls. Even if there was no cement, clay, gypsum, lime and so on could be used as a blending agent. It was just that the house that was cut out in the end was not as strong as reinforced concrete, and there was no way to build it too high. Most of the houses in this world were one-story bungalows. If the second floor was intended to be an attic, it could be a structure of wood mixed with bricks. Soren's plan took a lot of things into consideration. A day passed quickly. Soren sent out half of his men, mainly to continue to transport supplies. Although 6 ships of supplies were enough for them to eat and wear for more than 3 months, it was not enough for them to build a town. Before the infrastructure here was completed and could be self-sufficient, everything needed to rely on Port Tylon as a transit station. Most of the other pirates thought that Soren intended to build a base in the outer islands. They never thought that his plan was bigger than everyone thought. Pirate kings basically had overseas lairs, such as the Swamp King's Devil Island, or the Naga Pirate King's Angry Scales Island. In fact, most people thought that Soren was preparing to build his lair in the outer islands, and then control a large number of pirates to control the sea route. In the future he could rely on this sea route to make money. The next morning, after Soren divided the simple camp area, he began to join the labor process. Although he knew that there were still many things that he needed to explore, he still patiently focused on the construction of the camp. As long as the camp was completed, this area would be his territory. Even if he was attacked, he could defend himself. In the future, he could slowly explore the surrounding area. However, if the camp was not established, it would be quite troublesome if they were attacked by the indigenous people. Perhaps the pirates wouldn't suffer too many casualties, but most of the slaves would die. Resources, population, and land. Soren silently stood up and glanced at Vivian, who was flipping through a book with her head tilted to one side. She was even using her small white hand to hold a quill and scribble on a piece of white paper. He couldn't help but smile. Vivian's innate profession was a warlock. A warlock didn't need to learn too many things. Casting spells was completely dependent on one's innate ability. However, Vivian also had a part-time job as a wizard. What she was doing now was learning magic knowledge by herself and using the wizard's way to master casting skills. He took a look and left. The little girl was more obedient than before. She seemed to know that he had a very important plan, and most of the time she would quietly do her own things. Soren quickly led a group of people towards the forest. Yesterday a lot of trees were cut down, but they were only used to build tents. Today more wood was needed. It was best to make a part of the fence outside. For this reason, Soren had to do it himself. Brute force. Soren looked at the trees in front of him. First, he blessed himself with a strength spell, and then he walked to a trunk as thick as his thigh. He took a deep breath. With a clang, the legendary curved sword Icing Death appeared with a cold light, and then the tree in front of him was cut off. With a creaking sound, a big tree fell down. Soren didn't even look at it again. The pirate minions behind him went into battle with their swords and axes. After a while, the branches above were cut off. Soon, a simple log appeared on the spot. 2 burly and majestic pirates came from behind, each carrying one side of the log, and walked away. At this time, Soren had already cut down 3 big trees in front of him. 20 or 30 pirate minions spread out and chopped with their swords and axes for a while. They piled the branches on the other side to make a fire, and then let the others carry the 3 logs back. Houses were being built in the camp, and the fence outside was also being raised. This amount of wood was simply not enough. Soren's cutting speed was very fast. He almost maintained the speed of cutting down 3 trees in a minute. After cutting down a tree with his sword, he rested for more than 10 seconds and then cut down another tree. There were already a large number of pirate minions behind him. Now there were at least 60 or 70 people. Even with so many people behind him to deal with the trees that had been cut down, there were still more than 20 that had not been dealt with yet. Outside, the pirates responsible for carrying the logs back were all tired and sweating profusely. Soren's breathing was still very steady. His extraordinary physique was undoubtedly revealed in this situation. He continuously cut down 50 trees before stopping. He let out a small breath and relaxed his arms. His arms were numb from the continuous exertion of force. The pirate minions behind him were all busy. They hurriedly gathered the other logs that had been cut down and sent them back to the camp to build a fence. Soren naturally didn't stop because his body couldn't take it anymore. It was only because the duration of the brute force spell was up. Cutting down trees required the support of strength. Without the buff spell, his efficiency would be greatly reduced. However, Soren had already memorized a large number of spells in advance. Not only did he memorize the brute force spell for all the second circle spell slots, he also memorized the brute force spell for the third circle spell slots. What he just used was the normal version of the brute force spell. If it was the third circle brute force spell, Soren's spell effect and duration would be increased by 50%. This was the value of the brute force spell. Soren's efficiency was indeed quite amazing. In just 1 or 2 hours he had already cut down hundreds of trees. After that, a large group of pirate minions were busy handling the logs and transporting them back. Now the fence of the entire camp was partially completed. The slaves were under the command of the pirate leader to drive the logs into the ground. It was estimated that a sturdy wooden fence would be completed in 1 or 2 days. And this was only the beginning. Soren wanted to build more than just a fence here. Then, she stopped at one of the pages and lifted her little white finger to point at a line of words. Then she flipped to the next page. There were many words and pictures there. The little girl frowned and looked at it for a while, then murmured, "The best material for building a wizard tower is not any stone, but stone made with the mud to stone spell. This kind of stone is quite strong. After a simple enchantment, it can reach the level of hardness above marble." She turned to the second page and continued to read. If combined with the magic arts left over from the Arcane Empire, mud to stone can make the stones made by magic as hard as steel. She did not know if it was deliberately erased by someone, or if it was unintentionally damaged by time. All the information about the mud to rock spell and how hard it was to turn the stones into steel through alchemy had become stains that couldn't be seen clearly. Vivian's brows furrowed as she read this, and she couldn't help but say angrily, "Which bastard did this?" She lifted her little hand and kept flipping to the back. However, the back had already turned to the layout of the wizard tower. There was no mention of the overall construction material of the wizard tower. The little girl was so angry that she directly threw the thick book into the dimensional belt. Then she held her chin with her little hand and said, "It's a pity that my spell slots are not enough. Otherwise I can help my brother build a camp with mud to stone. The book that Sister Gloria gave me seems to have recorded that this spell changes the soil according to the casting level and casting strength. It seems that every point is about 2 feet square. I wonder how large the area I can change? Yes, I'll try it when I have time." The little girl tilted her head and muttered for a while. Then she seemed to feel a little sleepy and could not help but walk into the tent. Recently, she had been more sleepy, but what made her happy was that she had grown taller. Mud to stone, level 5 spell. The spellcaster can transform soil into stone. This transformation process is permanent. Every point of spell strength can transform 2 feet square of soil. Many building materials, including the structure of the wizard tower, are made of mud to stone. The effect of this spell will be permanently changed after use. Spells such as Dispel Magic cannot be used to remove the transformation effect. Phew. Soren took a deep breath and put away the curved sword in his hand. A large area of the nearby trees had been cut down by him. Perhaps it was because everything had to start from scratch, he actually felt like he had returned to the slash and burn era. In fact, the fastest way was to rely on the power of the wizards. However, he did not have any spellcasters, so he could only use the simplest way to open up the camp. There was a level 5 wizard spell called Mud to Stone. This spell could directly turn soil into stone. At that time, there was a guild with rich spellcasters who directly relied on spells to build a city wall in a day. However, there was still a big limit to the spell slots. If the goddess of magic died, the spell slots would be converted into mana. At that time, although the spellcasting ability of the wizards would be weakened, they would have a lot more freedom to cast spells. If all the mana was invested into the level 5 spell Mud to Stone, only a small number of wizards would be able to achieve amazing results. The creation ability of the wizards could not be ignored in the pioneering tactics of the past, especially the development of the outer planes and the abyss. Soren put away his sword and looked behind him. The pirate minions were still busy moving the logs. He took a deep breath and then looked at his data display. He found that there was an extra row of words on it: training successful. You have obtained part of the information of sword form, horizontal slash. Training successful. You have obtained part of the information of sword form, horizontal slash. Training successful. You have mastered the combat skill, sword form, horizontal slash. Sword form, horizontal slash. It was a more basic combat skill of the sword form. In fact, it was a prerequisite skill of the sword form, waist slash. This was the easiest sword form skill to master in logging. Its combat effect was similar to the sword form, heavy slash. Its strength was strengthened to Soren's current standard, especially after his attributes were increased. These more basic sword force abilities were all integrated into his normal attacks. This was because this kind of force exertion technique no longer caused him too much of a burden. With enough attribute points as a foundation, he slightly skipped the previous requirement of charging force. As long as he did not use it consecutively, he could use it in his normal attacks. There were actually many types of sword forms. Basically, they were suitable for most weapon attacks. If a melee profession did not have a combat specialty, they would have to train and master enough combat skills. It was said that there were more than 100 types of sword forms. The foundation for a grand swordsman to advance into a legendary was to understand these basic sword forms. Soren did not have any mandatory requirements for sword forms. However, mastering more sword forms would increase his combat power. Moreover, many powerful combat skills in the future would require the coordination of basic sword forms. For example, mastering sword form, horizontal slash, would have a strong effect when comprehending and using sword form, beheading in the future. Many sword forms and skills were interconnected. Yellow sand was flying all over the sky. A slightly stooped figure was moving forward at the edge of the desert. Judging from his face, he did not seem to be very old. However, his face was full of vicissitudes and fatigue. His hair seemed to have not been washed for a long time. There was stubble on his chin and there was a lot of dust in his hair. He was wearing mottled armor. There were sword marks on his shoulder armor. There was a bandage on his arm, and there was a trace of blood seeping out from it. The originally bright silver armor seemed to be a little dim at the moment. It seemed that it had not been maintained for a long time. It looked very worn out. There was a long sword on his waist. From time to time he looked up into the distance. His hand seemed to be hanging on the hilt, ready to fight at any time. This was a young paladin. Or rather, he used to be a paladin. Now he was just a wandering warrior. He seemed to have been walking for a long time. Even the sturdy and durable boots on his feet were almost worn out. However, he still did not stop, as if there was something very important waiting for him in front of him. The wind stirred up the sand and dust. Soon, his whole body was gray and covered with a layer of dust. The young warrior shook his clothes, shaking off the dust on the ground, and then continued to move forward silently. His lips were a little chapped, and there were blood stains at the corners of his mouth. However, he didn't drink any water because there wasn't much water left on him. Just like that, he kept walking forward. When it got dark, he would stop to camp and eat some hard rations. He didn't need a tent, so he just leaned against the corner and slept with his clothes on. His hands were always holding his sword, and even when he slept, he hugged it to his chest. He did not know how long he had been walking. It was not until an old middle-aged man appeared in front of him that he stopped. He knelt in front of the other party on one knee, inserted the long sword into the ground and pressed his palm on his chest. This was the etiquette of a paladin. The other party seemed to have expected his arrival. He just said in a hoarse voice, "What have you learned along the way?" The young paladin looked up. There seemed to be a trace of sadness in his eyes, but more than that, he said slowly, "There is something called justice, and justice requires great strength. P.S. There were a lot of things today. It took me a long time to write this. On the 11th day of quitting smoking, I gained more than a pound." Chapter 254. Time passed day by day. In the blink of an eye, Soren had been here for 5 days. The camp was completely different from when he first arrived. Outside the camp, there was a 5-meter-tall fence. Every 100 meters there was a simple arrow tower. It was the kind of tower that could be reached by climbing up a ladder. There were 4 gates in the camp. The east was where Soren lived, the west was where the other pirates lived, the south was where a large amount of materials were stored, and the north was where a large number of slaves were locked up. The layout of the camp was square. There were specially dug drainage channels on both sides of the road. There were even toilets built on all 4 sides. This was something that the other pirates couldn't understand. This was because this area was dirty and messy. Even in the developed cities along the coast, there were very few toilets. Many people would just go to the alleys to relieve themselves. However, this was very important to Soren. Even though he used to live in the slums, when he had the ability to directly plan, the first order he gave was to build toilets. From today onwards, no one was allowed to relieve themselves in the camp. If they wanted to relieve themselves, they had to go to the toilets. If anyone dared to relieve themselves in the camp, they would be caught and their tools would be chopped off. Sanitation was the most important thing. This was because the environment of the outer islands was very easy to breed mosquitoes. If the disease spread, it was definitely not something that Soren wanted to see. Moreover, no one would like to accidentally step on other people's urine in their own territory. Even though Soren wasn't a clean freak, this was still a very important point. At this moment, looking down from the sky, the camp was an irregular square. It looked a bit like a Greek village. There was a large square in the middle, mainly for the convenience of gathering people. The 4 sides were divided by 2 intersecting streets. The ground was flattened. Even though the roads were made of mud, there were ditches dug around the roads. There were also a few wells nearby that could drain the dirty water. There were many houses in the camp that were being built, but most of them weren't completed yet. The only thing that was completed was the warehouse. This was mainly because they were afraid of the rain. The warehouse had to be completed as soon as possible. This was even more important than Soren's house, because many of the materials could not be exposed to the rain. The food reserves were enough to last them for more than 3 months, but it was better to store the food in the warehouse. Things like smoked meat were fine, but other things would quickly become moldy if they were exposed to moisture. In the place where the slaves worked, there were 2 crosses. The corpses on top were almost turned into white bones. The whole process could be said to be very cruel. Many slaves were so scared that they didn't dare to look over here, even until today. The 2 wooden stakes had to be erected for another 2 days. During these 7 days they had attracted many vultures and crows. These scavenging birds were openly pecking at the corpses, causing many people to have a headache just by looking at them. The effect of torture was undoubtedly effective. At least during this period of time the slaves were very honest. And because Soren told the pirate minions not to whip them too much and to give them more food, the slaves had to work hard every day, but at least they could still fill their stomachs. And yesterday, due to His Excellency Throat Cutter's impromptu fishing, the shark caught was too much meat to finish. He only took the shark fins and so on, and then the slaves ate fish soup to their heart's content. This place was actually very good. Although it was primitive and barren, and there were many dangerous things such as annoying mosquitoes, the resources here were indeed very rich. Some slaves caught a kind of fat vole when they worked, and the indigenous slaves ate it directly. The other slaves brought it back and ate it by fire. Here they ate better than in the past. From time to time they would have some meat and fish, mainly because the nearby sea area had not been developed much, and they could pick up big crabs on the beach. In some ways this place really felt like the Great Northwest. The slaves themselves were people who had nothing, so their requirements were not very high. As long as they could fill their stomachs while working hard, and occasionally have a little meat, many people would be able to restrain their thoughts. After all, Soren had clearly told them that the fate of escaping and being caught was very miserable. Even after death they would not be easily free. Moreover, there were still some slaves who believed what Vivian said. When the time was right, Soren would give freedom to some of the hardworking people. Inside the big tent in the center, Soren frowned as he scribbled on a piece of white paper. He looked up at the sky and murmured, "They should have returned to Port Tylon by now, right? It will take half a month to go back and forth. I should be able to bring back what I need in January next year, and then I can start the next step of the plan." The end of December. It looks like the new year is coming, right? Soren walked out of the tent and silently calculated in his heart. He found that it was indeed the new year in a few days. In this world there were no strong New Year celebrations, but the tradition of preparing for the new year was still there. When Soren came, it was the middle of December. Now it was the end of December and the new year was coming in a few days. The new year was actually not that bad. The most important thing in this world was the harvest festival. This was the grandest celebration of the year. And this celebration was common to most gods. In the south, they sacrificed to the goddess of agriculture; in the north, and in the coastal areas they sacrificed to the goddess of the sea. Even the drows would pray to the queen of spiders for a year's harvest during the harvest festival, every year. After all, for any race, filling their stomachs was the most basic and most important thing. Soren looked outside and walked towards the sea. He let his pirate leaders drive away 2 ships, but there were still some warships left outside. The cargo ships of the Chamber of Commerce also went back. Soren's order was a large amount of materials. They would take 3 months to ship a part of it every half a month. The most important part was the slave resources. If Soren wanted to develop and grow, he could not do without labor. In a short period of time the pirates would not rebel, but if they were really used as labor these pirates would complain. For now, they knew that the base camp had just been built, and no one could avoid hard work. When the base camp was built, these pirates would not be so diligent. On the other side, Vivian's petite figure squatted next to a mud pit. Her white little hands played with a pile of mud as if she was molding a clay figurine. She used her small hands to mold the mud into various shapes. The little girl squatted beside the mud pit and seemed to have played for a long time. Even her snow-white princess dress was stained with mud. After about 10 minutes, she kneaded the mud into what looked like a cube. Then she raised her small hand and began to cast a spell. Mud to stone. A faint magic aura emerged, and the mud in front of her gradually turned into stone, but it did not seem to be solid. It looked like the kind that was weathered. The little girl's expression seemed to be a little annoyed. She kicked the mud away and murmured, "It's so difficult. Why is it so difficult to learn spells above the 5th circle? Obviously, 4th circle spells are quite easy, but why does the difficulty increase so much after entering the 5th circle? Lillian, why do you think we can't master this spell?" There was a short silence. Then Lillian said a little matter-of-factly, "I don't have to go through so much trouble to learn spells. Those who need to learn spells are not real geniuses." "Yes, that's it." Needless to say, Vivian also knew that she asked in vain. The little girl got up and snapped her fingers. Then there was a faint magic aura, and then her body became clean. Vivian clapped her little hands, raised her hand to tidy up her skirt, and then planned to go back to sleep. But at this moment she heard a noise coming from the bushes in the distance, and then a figure rushed out from inside. It was an ugly man with a tattoo on his face. His ears were full of earrings and there was a scar on his skull. This was a pirate. There were a lot of strange people among Sauron's men. Anyway, there were very few guys who could be considered as good-looking. He was a sentry sent out to monitor the movements nearby. Vivian's face did not show the slightest panic. Although she was only a little girl who had just turned 9 years old, she was quite calm at this time. The little girl approached little by little, while also paying attention to the nearby movements. She saw a blow dart on the back of the pirate sentinel in front of her. It was a weapon as slender as a needle. Most of it was smeared with a rather potent poison. It either had the effect of sealing one's throat upon contact with blood, or was able to quickly anesthetize a person to death. The little girl approached carefully and at the same time she had several spells on her body. The bushes in the distance moved a little. However, no one chased out. When Vivian walked over, the pirate was not completely unconscious, but he said in a somewhat intermittent voice, Miss, native. After saying that, he directly fainted. It seemed that the blow dart had a nerve anesthetic on it and not a poison that could kill blood. This kind of thing was very troublesome. It had to be a compulsory test of vitality. Maybe Soren had a higher chance of passing it, but the other pirates would have a hard time resisting it. Vivian stretched out her finger to check his breath. After confirming that he was not dead, she ran toward the camp. The natives had appeared. This must be told to Brother quickly because the natives were very xenophobic and it was very likely that they would attack. Chapter 255. Inside the tent. Soren stood in the middle with a serious expression. In front of him was a man who was surprisingly well dressed among the pirates. He even wore a monocle. But don't underestimate this guy. Looking at the calluses on his slender palms, you could see that he was an expert in using short weapons. He also had good throwing knife skills. He was one of the few pirates who could read and learn. He was also a doctor among the pirates. He was proficient in various surgical operations and had quite good medical skills. This man who looked like a noble tutor reached out and checked the breath of the unconscious man on the ground. Then he opened his eyelids and looked at his tongue. He slowly said, "Your Excellency." It seems that he wasn't poisoned, just temporarily unconscious. However, when he would be able to wake up would depend on his physique. Under normal circumstances, he should be able to wake up tomorrow morning. This guy's physique is still very good. Soren heard this and nodded. Then he walked around in a circle. He had actually sent out quite a number of scouts, but it seemed like only one of the 5 would return. If the other 4 didn't die in the hands of the Aborigines, they should have been caught by them. The area of this island was actually quite large. It was about 500 square kilometers. Because of the tropical rainforest-like climate and the fact that it was connected to other islands, there was a high possibility that there would be an Aboriginal tribe here. Soren had long sent people to explore the nearby area. For this reason he lost 3 to 5 people. At present, the exploration of the entire island was mainly concentrated around 10 kilometers around the camp. The most dangerous place was still the remains of those strange plants. Soren himself didn't dare to easily explore the secret. Then the more dangerous place was near the southern coast. There was a high cliff where about 3 groups of about 10 large pterosaurs lived. Then there was the direction near the northwest. After passing through the jungle and a big river, there was another place full of strange flowers and plants. Unsurprisingly, the Aboriginal tribe was there. It was about 30 kilometers away from Soren. There were several more dangerous areas in between, including the territory of some dangerous and fierce creatures in the outer islands. "Your Excellency?" A bald and ugly pirate raised his head to look at Soren and cautiously asked, "Do you want us to teach those native monkeys a lesson?" Soren turned around and looked at him. He slowly shook his head and said, "There's no rush. After all, this is still their territory. These Aborigines are more familiar with the terrain than we are. The most important thing for us is to figure out our surroundings and make sure that there are no creatures like army ants or flying insects nearby. Then we can have a good fight with them." Strictly speaking, this river was the most dangerous place, but it was only when people fell in. This was because there were a large number of piranhas that were only half the size of a palm. These piranhas had very sharp teeth. When they moved in groups, they could eat any creature that fell into the water. Even an elephant could be eaten clean in a short period of time. In the end, not even the bones were left behind. This kind of piranha was distributed in many places in the outer islands. This was one of them. The number was huge to millions, and they were very sensitive to the smell of blood. To cross the river, one must rely on a boat. Even the indigenous people couldn't swim over, not to mention the large electric eels in it. Electric eels were creatures that could electrocute an adult man near land. It was even more difficult to deal with them here. The large electric eels were almost as fast as a spell attack. The intensity of the electric current was quite dangerous. Some of the special electric eel bosses could directly electrocute a grade 3 profession. "Your Excellency." A one-eyed pirate next to him looked at Soren, who was in deep thought, and carefully said, "What do we do now? Don't we care about them? If we don't teach those indigenous monkeys a lesson, I'm afraid they'll think we're easy to deal with." The indigenous people deserved a beating. Their xenophobia was quite strong. If you didn't kill them, they would treat you as a soft persimmon. Even the pirates knew about this. Soren looked up at them and said, "Don't care about them for now. You guys prepare enough food and bring out the wine on the ship. It's almost the new year. Let the others have some good wine and meat first. Then we'll deal with them. During this time, I'll personally investigate them. For now, don't move too far away from the camp." Because Soren didn't touch a drop of alcohol, the pirates also banned alcohol during this time. The pirates below had already complained, but because they were afraid of Soren's prestige, no one dared to say it out loud. There were many drunkards among the pirates. During this time, there were also many who secretly drank a few mouthfuls, but there were still few who drank openly. There were too many pirates who were addicted to alcohol. Soren had to control them. Otherwise, there would be people who were drunk all day long. Soren wasn't against them drinking, but when it came to serious business, he definitely wouldn't allow people to drink and mess things up. The group of pirates quickly retreated from the tent. Although they didn't understand why Soren wanted them to celebrate the new year, the pirates below were really tired. There were already many who were complaining. Now that they were celebrating with wine and meat, it would be better to appease them. After all, pirates weren't soldiers. Their discipline was very low, and they obeyed orders out of respect. The ban on alcohol was lifted, and soon there were cheers in the camp. Many of the pirates secretly took out a small bottle and put it to their mouth to take a big gulp. This was the pirates' usual equipment, and it was filled with strong rum. This kind of rum had a high alcohol content, and it could be used to disinfect when necessary. It was a habit passed down from the northern pirates. Perhaps it was because the new year was coming, but the pirates' tempers were much better. They didn't even beat or scold the slaves. Boxes of supplies were moved out. There were smoked meat, vegetables, salted fish, and so on. Soren actually prepared a lot of things, including things that the pirates didn't think would be useful. A day passed just like that. Soren looked at the rare happy atmosphere in the camp, and the corner of his mouth showed a trace of a smile, but it seemed a little cruel. Let them have a good new year. He looked up and murmured, "Next year will be the most difficult year. Whether we can gain a foothold here will depend on whether we can get rid of the indigenous people next year. The other dangerous areas and all kinds of wild monsters could wait. Because the monsters had an area of activity. If no one provoked them, the monsters in the outer islands wouldn't easily run to other places, including the most aggressive and predatory large pterosaur. Most of their hunting areas were fixed, so the most troublesome thing was the indigenous people. As long as the indigenous people were defeated, there would be time to clean up other small problems. Moreover, for Soren the indigenous people had a greater meaning. He needed slave labor for his development, and in the end he would have to find a solution from the indigenous people. If this was the case, then things would have to be carefully planned. P.S. After some adjustment, I'm in a much better state. I'm back to normal. There will be more at the end of the month. Chapter 256. In the evening. Soren had changed into a tight suit. He cut his shoulder-length hair with a curved sword and cut it to about the length of his earlobe. At this moment his appearance was a little different from before. There was almost nothing on his body. His wrists and legs were wrapped with cloth strips, and he didn't wear any armor, not even light leather armor. The only thing that stood out was the Battlemaster gloves on his hands. Almost all of his equipment and weapons were in it. Next to Soren was Vivian with a pout. The little girl looked unhappy and muttered, "I want to go too. Brother, why don't you let me go with you? If we go together, we might be able to kill those aborigines directly. I'm worried about you going alone. There are so many of them. What if you're discovered?" Soren squatted down when he heard this. He reached out and stroked Vivian's little head and said softly, "If I go and you go with me, then there will be no one to guard the camp. If something happens, those pirates will easily collapse. I'll be more relieved if you stay here. Besides, there won't be any danger if I go alone. There are almost no people in this place who can stop me from coming and going freely." Speaking of this, Soren's face showed a confident smile. He had been to many dangerous areas. There were many monsters in the abyss that could see through invisibility and seal the plane, but he still went back and forth. Although his strength was not as strong as before, there were no real gods in the outer islands. At most, there were some legendary monsters that were close to the demigod level. Throughout the thousands of years of the outer islands, no one had heard of a god with weak divine power. Perhaps it was because the Storm Lord was above them, and he would kill any signs of a god with weak divine power. Vivian nodded gently, but the expression on her cute little face was still a little unhappy. She looked at Soren seriously and said with a serious expression, "Brother, you can go alone, but you have to let me leave a spell mark on you. That way if you're in danger I can find a way to teleport to help you." Spell imprint? Soren didn't think too much about it. He nodded and said, "All right." Vivian clapped her hands and stood up. She looked around with her big round eyes and no one knew what she was thinking. Once Soren agreed, she immediately began to cast her spell. Something was wrong. Soren felt that something was wrong when the little girl started casting her spell. Spell imprint was a very simple low-level arcane spell. With Vivian's strength as a legendary warlock and her powerful talent, it was impossible for her to take such a long time to cast it. Although Soren's spellcraft identify wasn't high enough to determine what spell the little girl was casting, he was sure that it was a very difficult spell. It was probably a level 6 or higher spell. He wanted to interrupt the little girl's spell casting, but he was afraid that it would hurt her. "Vivian. What are you doing?" Soren had no choice but to stare at Vivian until she finished chanting the last part of the spell. Only then did he understand what spell she was casting. A terrible pressure shrouded the area. This pressure was stronger than the dragon's aura of an adult dragon, but it wasn't as overbearing. Following the appearance of a spell, a portal opened in front of the two of them. A creature full of power and divine radiance appeared from the portal. It first glanced at Soren, then its eyes fell on the little Vivian. This creature full of divine power and divine radiance stared at the little girl in front of it. It couldn't help but frown slightly and said in a dull voice, "Spellcaster. Are you summoning me? You look like a little girl who hasn't grown up, whether it's your body or your soul. Are you sure you want to make a deal with me?" Jinn? When Soren saw the creature in front of him, he immediately guessed what spell Vivian had just cast. Limited Wish. Level 7 spell. The Jinn in front of him looked a bit like the monster in Aladdin's magic lamp. Its upper body was still in human form, and its skin was pale blue. Its pupils seemed to flash with lightning from time to time, which was the light of divinity. Any Jinn summoned by wish was at the level of a god. The strength level of the one in front of him couldn't be judged, but it was definitely a Jinn above the demigod level. The Jinn of the elemental plane had special rules. They followed the constraints of contracts and laws, and would trade with spellcasters when necessary. This was a Jinn above the demigod level. Now it was its avatar, not the main body of the Jinn. Only some very special transactions could make the main body of the Jinn appear. It was even possible to summon the oldest elemental god. Knowledge, War. The creatures of the wind elemental plane once beat up the abyss demons, and these Jinn were the vanguards. Vivian looked up at Soren and then said to the Jinn in front of her with a serious face, at #yen asterisk hashtag at yen hashtag at hashtag percent at hashtag percent hashtag yen percent at hashtag yen at percent yen at hashtag percent at hashtag percent hashtag. As soon as the little girl spoke, Soren was instantly dumbfounded because she was speaking the demonic language. He had never felt so deeply that learning a foreign language was so important, especially when it came to the demonic language which was widely used in many planes. The Jinn was a neutral creature. The 4 elemental planes were basically not involved in the battle between the upper and lower planes. Unless there was any idiot who was ready to unify the universe and transform the entire multidimensional plane into one form, the 4 elemental planes would basically not stand up and do anything. Therefore the Jinn could also trade with the demons. As long as it was any spellcaster who used the wishing spell, they could trade with them. Chapter 257. Under the dim light of the night. Soren's figure flew out, shuttling through the dense tropical jungle, moving towards the distance at high speed. He was not unfamiliar with such a terrain. When he came to the outer islands to complete a legendary level mission, Soren also fought with the best trackers here. This group of guys had a very powerful tracking ability. They could track the target through footprints, smell, environment, and so on. Even Soren had improved a lot of tracking skills after fighting with them. Pada. Soren's toes tapped lightly on a big tree, and then slowly landed on the ground. There were many messy footprints in front of him. Although a lot of them were covered by weeds, the traces left by high-speed movements were still very obvious. Soren raised his hand and looked for traces of something being dragged away. It was a bit like the traces left by heels. He found a little dark red blood, but there was not much blood. It seemed that the battle was over soon. Soren could already imagine the situation at that time. The pirate scouts he sent out were suddenly attacked, and before they could react, most of them were killed. Then one of them successfully escaped, and the other scouts were dragged away. Looks like they're all masters. Soren's eyes showed a trace of coldness, and his face showed a cruel expression. He slowly said, "Kill these scouts first. They seem to be the elites of the indigenous tribes." Jungle fighting was different from flat ground fighting. The most common thing here was encounter and ambush fighting. Even a grade 4 profession could die in the hands of a low-grade profession that was proficient in tracking and hiding. Because there were too many environments for ambush, and there were many natural traps that could be used. Many brilliant trackers could kill other professions that were 5 levels higher than them here. The most dangerous ability of these indigenous people was tracking and hiding traps, and then there were the use of blow darts and hidden weapons, etc. However, this time they might not be so lucky because rogues were also experts in this field. Soren moved quickly along the traces in the grass. His tracking ability was not very good, but it was not enough to lose the traces left today. Brilliant rangers could even track the traces left a few days ago, and even distinguish what kind of enemy left them. Therefore, Soren had always attached great importance to tracking skills. He moved quickly along the grass. He could be sure that the indigenous elites had not returned to the tribe, because they could not know the number of Soren's men if they were not close to the camp. Shadow hiding. After crossing a stream, Soren's figure gradually disappeared into the night. He heard a little movement. It was a scream. It seemed that the pirate scouts sent out during the day were not all killed by them, and 1 or 2 survivors were brought back by them. A trace of killing intent appeared in Soren's eyes. His whole body was shrouded in shadows, and he approached the mountain wall in front of him where some screams came from. There were many places in the outer islands that looked like the Irish coastline. The landscape structure here was completely different from the southern continental shelf. What Soren saw in front of him was a natural cave. It seemed that the enemy was quite familiar with the nearby terrain. No one had come to this cave for a long time. It was a little dark inside and the cave was not very deep. Soren heard a slight scream again and saw a faint fire in the cave. It seemed that there was a corner in the cave. He did not recklessly sneak in. Soren reached out and touched the ground, carefully observing the surroundings. His dark vision allowed him to see as clearly at night as during the day. Soon he found a rather clever alarm trap. The indigenous people were very cunning, and their living environment was also very harsh. For someone who could easily kill the pirate scouts sent by Soren, it was impossible for them to be unprepared at night. Soren's trap skills were not enough. He glanced at it and felt that he might not be able to successfully remove the trap without making a sound. Even if he was lucky enough to remove it, it would take too long. Soren reached out and grabbed the edge of the cave. Then he climbed into the cave along the corner as if he was hanging in the air. He was just 1 or 2 centimeters away from the alarm trap. The people inside the trap would be immediately alerted. The scream continued. There were broken stones in the cave, so Soren had to be careful. He heard the common language and the indigenous language, but he could not hear what was being said clearly because the screams were interrupted. The enemy seemed to be interrogating. Soren did not dare to be careless. His figure slowly approached in the dark. As he turned a corner, the situation in front of him appeared in front of his eyes. He saw 5 indigenous people with oil paint on their bodies. The skin of these indigenous people was darker, but it was not like the black race. Instead, it was like a mixture of the black race and the Native Americans. The bone structure of these guys was thicker, obviously thicker than the bone frame of the mainland people. They were interrogating a pirate scout. The pirate who was being interrogated was badly mutilated. His appearance could not be distinguished at all. His breathing was also very weak. It seemed that he would not last long. There was an indigenous person who looked different next to him. It was obvious that he did not have oil paint on his body. A cold light appeared in Soren's eyes, because he recognized that this indigenous person was one of the slaves who escaped from him. Because he knew the common language, he was helping to translate the interrogation and telling them the information in the indigenous language. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Soren's eyes were full of killing intent. He quietly approached the enemy who had been asking questions and looked like the leader of the indigenous people. Backstab. Shadow strike. An icy cold light suddenly appeared. Soren's figure emerged from the shadows. The legendary curved sword Icing Death drew a cold light and instantly pierced the heart of the indigenous leader. The tip of the sword penetrated from the back to the chest. The other party's expression was full of shock. Before he could change, he died under Soren's hands. A row of data quickly appeared. Shadow strike successful. Shadow strike launched. Backstab launched. Successfully launched backstab causing 116 plus 10, piercing damage to the target. Piercing the target's heart. Triggered the test of death. Target's test of death failed. Target dead. Extracting the target's soul energy. Received 3250 Slaughter EXP. As the Slaughter EXP data emerged, Soren immediately guessed the approximate strength of the opponent in his mind. It should be an enemy above profession level 15, a leader in the indigenous tribe. The enemy seemed to have more than 100 HP, but because his heart was pierced, he did not pass the test of death. Therefore, he could not survive for a period of time like some of the enemies that Soren had encountered in the past. Sword form, spinning strike. After killing the enemy's leader with a sneak attack, Soren did not retreat. On the contrary, he rushed up directly. Another curved sword appeared in his hands out of thin air. He spun it in a circle and slashed at the other 2 enemies in front of him. Caught off guard. This was the most common reaction under a sneak attack. Many people were caught off guard and their ability to dodge and parry was greatly reduced. In this case, it was the best time to test one's ability. One of the indigenous people almost subconsciously dodged sideways, then rolled to open the distance, but the other indigenous person was a little slower. He was directly hit in the chest by Soren, and even a large part of his lung was cut open. The former was an indigenous person with a reflex evasion ability, while the latter obviously did not have any powerful evasion ability. Once he encountered a sudden situation, he would inevitably be slower by half a beat. Swoosh. In the face of Soren, who suddenly appeared and killed their leader, the indigenous people reacted quickly. They began to fight back quickly. However, instead of pulling out a weapon, they quickly took out a blow dart. With a few faint cold lights, the blow dart flew out like steel needles. They hit Soren's body, but it did not have the effect it should have. Stone skin. The blow dart did not break through Soren's stone skin. These blow dart with strong anesthetic had no effect at all. The blow dart fell to the ground, but Soren jumped out and slashed at the seriously injured enemy. A row of data quickly appeared. Shadow Strike activated. You've dealt 56+10 / damage to the target. You've dealt 26 / damage to the target. Target dead. Extracting target soul energy, gain 2150 slaughter EXP. Soren's sword was extremely fast. Almost at the same time as the icing death in his right hand slashed the enemy, the curved sword in his left hand immediately slashed the enemy's abdomen. Soren, who had mastered greater dual wielding, could almost achieve the effect of left and right mutual attack. The curved sword in both hands could fight independently. When he killed the indigenous person in front of him, his left hand almost immediately turned around and directly blocked the attack from the side. Then he bent forward and slashed the enemy's arm with his right hand. With a splash of blood, 3 fingers were cut off. Thump. Soren's 2 swords turned into cold lights, and he turned around to cut off half of the hand. At the same time, a distorted shadow appeared beside him, and then 2 heads fell to the ground. Shadow Strike. Summon Shadow. Sword form beheading. Soren's eyes were cold, and he did not hesitate at all. When the summoned shadow in front of him entangled the enemy, he slashed at the enemy's head. Thump. A headless body fell to the ground. Soren was covered in blood, and there was only one enemy left in front of him. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.